All right, let's take a seat so we can get started. I know this is way too much fun, right? Getting to reconnect with colleagues and friends.
If you weren't here, you'd be in your bedroom sitting on Zoom, so come on. Do we want to?
It's like the cows being let out in springtime. All right, I think we're ready to get started. So first of all, I hope everyone had a good lunch. And I did notice people were taking advantage of the patio outside, which is really nice. So hopefully enjoying the outside and it wasn't too hot, or at least not yet. One of the things I did want to mention is I know we didn't get to the opportunity to ask a lot of questions after the last session. But there will be opportunity tomorrow to ask a lot more questions. Obviously, during the networking time and during the breaks, feel free to, stop George and have a detailed discussion with George or any of the ISO SMEs and catch them for any detailed questions you might have. So before I move into the next focused group discussion, or actually it's our first focus group discussion on day-ahead resource efficiency evaluation, I just want Mark to clarify a couple of things from the prior discussion. Mark?
Yeah, great, thank you. Hope everybody enjoyed lunch. So that discussion, the last discussion, especially George, went kind of quick. I just want to highlight a couple things or clarify a couple things. One is, we do believe that the whole confidence in transfers is enhanced, not diminished with the EDAM, and that's because we are coordinating the use and procurement of that imbalance reserve that kind of creates that market cushion for the transfers. I think it also allows bringing the imbalance reserve into the IFM. It builds confidence in whatever comes out of the IFM, and less likely that RUC will kind of undo potentially what does clear the IFM, which I think is an enhancement. At the back end, I want to make sure it's clear that when we talk about this corner condition where we may be getting into a balancing area, maybe getting into consideration of, well, can I continue to serve my load, or is there any issues there? I don't want it misunderstood that the market operator for the EDAM is not the one who is distributing or allocating load shed across all the EDAM balancing areas. We'll have to deal with our balancing area. Other balancing areas will have to deal with their balancing area. When we talked about the proportional reduction of load and or transfers, it's transfers. The transfers could be adjusted. How that affects the balancing area will be a balancing area consideration. They may have some additional tools to insulate from that, but we're not an RTO. We're not allocating load shed across the RTO footprint. So I want to be clear about that. Okay? Any follow-up on that?
Any questions for Mark on that particular topic?
Okay.
No. Okay.
I think we can continue.
All right. So I think we can continue now with our first focus discussion, the day-ahead resource efficiency evaluation. And so Danny is going to lead this discussion, obviously joined by Mark, George, and Milosh. So go ahead, Danny.
Thank you, Joanne. So the three topics we're looking to talk about this afternoon, we actually got questions on all three of these this morning. This is the CAISO's proposed treatment of non-resource specific supply. There's a few different flavors of this that we'll walk through. We'll then talk in a more detailed manner about the pooled EIM RSC and the interplay with the reliability and the diversity benefit of the EDAM. Finally, we will touch on failure consequences. I'm looking to have about 30 minutes of slides and then would open it up to discussion for clarifying questions or just general questions following these slides. So, okay, speakers. The first type of non-resource specific supply I wanted to talk about were the WSPP Schedule C contracts. Again, these are prevalent across the West. They're part of supplementing supply portfolios for next day operating plans. These are part of the RA imports into the CAISO BAA and also support imports into other Western BAAs. If you looked at the general qualities of these contracts, they tend to be firm energy that cannot be interrupted for economic reasons. They are typically delivered to a specified point where the title of energy changes hands. Often this would be the intertie into the BAA in which they sink. At the time we're running the day-ahead market, though, the proposal's at 10 a.m., the source BAA, the specific resource, and the transmission is often not known. So there are a lot of unknowns associated with crediting this supply type. With all this said, the ISO would still be proposing to count these in the EDAM. They would be essentially supply that can be used to meet the obligation of the BAA. Mechanically, how we would do this, we would represent these as a self-scheduled injection into the sync BAA at that scheduling point that is known by the balancing authority area who's contracting for these. The sync BAA would then assume a financial position for the schedule. In addition, we would look to implement rules that would prevent gaming opportunities that could arise from moving that scheduling point between the day ahead and real-time timeframes to try to game congestion differences. As was mentioned in the transmission discussion and in the RSC discussion this morning, the full transmission path of these schedules is not known. At this point, we're not even proposing to require bucket 1 transmission as part of the showing on the injection point into the sync BAA. Finally, given the sensitivity of these and some of the concerns that we heard in the working groups, the ISO at a minimum would look to monitor these types of arrangements. And I think to the extent that stakeholders would like us to try to develop additional incentives to try to incent performance for these arrangements, that's something we would be open to doing. So what are the impacts of trying to consider these non-resource specific firm energy contracts in the EDAM? What are the pricing and reliability impacts? So like I mentioned earlier, they're modeled as an injection into the sync BAA, but where does that injection come from? Not knowing where it comes from, the best approximation is probably modeling it from the source or from the BAA on the immediate other side of that intertie. If you don't know where it's coming from, it's probably more likely to at least, or there's a greater likelihood that it may come from that neighbor than it comes from some BAA that is electrically distant from the sync BAA. This does have the potential to impact day-ahead flows and day-ahead prices. Again, we would model it as distributed to the DGAP in the neighboring BAA. So all of this would show up as additional supply within that BAA. The second item which we wanted to highlight and solicit feedback from the stakeholder community on is to what extent should these types of contracts be included in the day-ahead market's congestion management. We are proposing to include them in congestion management. The benefit of this would be that it ensures that the scheduling point in the intertie that these contracts are supposed to flow across is not double used in the day-ahead timeframe. You could imagine a situation where a BAA represented a large injection of a WSPP Schedule C contract onto a scheduling point that was already fully subscribed with buckets 1, 2, and 3 transmission in the EDAM. If you don't include these in the congestion management, then the resulting market solution could be infeasible flowing into the real-time time frame. However, the downside of putting these into congestion management is effectively it would give equal priority to these non-firm supply contracts as to the transfers that would flow resulting from the buckets 1, 2, and 3 transmission made available. Moving on to the second non-resource specific supply type we wanted to talk more about, and this would be intertie bids at the CAISO border. We are proposing to count these as available supply in the RSC, as well as to utilize these in the market clearing process. These are to a large extent somewhat analogous to the WSPP Schedule C contracts. I think one of the items that Jan brought out this morning, which is interesting though, is that whether these are counted in the RSC is one question, but there is a second question that why would they not be counted in the RSC if they would be available to be utilized in the market? Because these contracts, to the extent that the economics makes, or these import bids, to the extent that the economics make sense, could displace supply that was shown as part of the RSC showing. I think the simple example is you could have a 500 megawatt resource that is shown as part of the RSC that is bid in fairly expensive. There is cheaper import supply. The market would naturally not utilize that more expensive resource that was shown in part of the RSC and would utilize the import supply. So we're open to some additional considerations on import bids, given some of the concerns we've heard. Again, to the extent that entities don't think these should count, we are looking to understand what are the risks in counting these, and then trying to draw a contrast to if we still would plan to utilize them in the market clearing process, is not counting them in the RSC really achieving anything? The second item would be, to the extent that these may be unreliable, should there be performance metrics in place to derate import supply for RSC counting? There is the potential for these not to materialize as you move into real time. That's, I think, something that's been acknowledged through the CAISO's reporting and the DMM's reporting. So to the extent that's a problem, does this need to be accounted for in the RSC? The third item is some type of I always struggle with this word, attestation necessary to make these more equivalent to the WSPP Schedule C contracts, which are firm contracts and would have more of a commitment than just an import bid with an intent to deliver. The final type of non-resource specific supply I wanted to bring up was demand response. So if these demand response can be represented as a PDR or RDRR resource, great. They can participate in the market. This is better for market efficiency. To the extent they can't, we are looking to allow them to participate through effectively representing the planned demand response, the load modification, as an offset in the obligation that is used in the RSC. This would require a commitment that these programs would be utilized the next day. One of the things that we're trying to avoid is having entities say, I have a demand response program that I could use if I need to, but let me see if I can bid in all of my load and clear enough EDAM transfers to displace the need to utilize these demand response programs. So our view is, if you intend to use them, let's plan on using them. We would credit you in the RSC, we'd adjust your RUC target, and then we would also create a load bidding rule to not allow load to be bid up beyond what the resulting adjusted demand would be that would be used in the RUC process and in the RSC. So the simple example you can see at the bottom illustrates this concept. You have 6,000 megawatts of supply, or 6,000 megawatts of demand, 5,500 megawatts of supply. The BA is short. They say, oh, I have a 500 megawatt DR program that doesn't qualify to participate as a resource. Let's plan on using that, right? Effectively in the RSC, your target is now 5,500 megawatts you can pass. However, we would put a cap on the amount of load that could be bid into the IFM at 5,500 megawatts to not allow economic transfers to displace the use of these. And similarly, the RUC target would also be adjusted. So the more general questions on non-resource specific supply is, to what extent is there a desire within the stakeholder community to account for these in the RSC and credit them? From the working group process, it did seem that there was a strong desire to figure out a way to account for these. However, getting that through written comments would let us understand the positions of all the different parties with regards to WSPP Schedule Cs. The second question I'd like to pose is there an opportunity for these contracts to evolve in light of the new EDAM design? I know when WEIM went live, a lot of the tagging deadlines shifted out, I think, to around T57 to be able to represent these types of supply contracts on the second advisory RSC in the WEIM. So is there a similar opportunity going forward, where at least maybe the source BAA could be known, so we could accurately model the source of this energy within the market, and then maybe to the extent that BAA is an EDAM participant, would bucket 1 transmission be a requirement, or showing be a requirement to count these, thus ensuring that essentially these do not displace the value of that bucket 1 transmission. Finally, are there additional metrics that would be needed to incent performance of this non-resource specific supply? We did talk about a couple different ways where this could be done, about if these do not materialize, is there an additional requirement for the RSC that a BAA could receive for some period of time that reflects potential unreliability of these types of contracts? This is something that, to the extent that stakeholders are interested, we would look to design with stakeholders. So the second, or rather than taking questions on that, hopefully you have a few minutes to kind of jot them down, because I'm going to try to run through the last 2 topics and then open it up for questions. The next topic is the interplay between the diversity benefit and the pooled WEIM RSC approach. So we are planning to offer a diversity benefit in the EDAM construct. This is basically offsetting uncertainty that can materialize in different BAAs. The simplest way to think of this is you have 2 BAAs who are neighbors. They both have a bunch of solar resources. You know clouds are moving through that area. You don't know if they're going to be over the solar resources in BAA1 or BAA2, so there's quite a lot of uncertainty for each of those BAAs. But if you take a step back and you collectively look at those 2 BAAs, you probably have a much more accurate forecast of what the total output would be from those 2 BAAs. So again, offsetting uncertainty. This is applied to the imbalance reserve requirement, because that is what is there to address uncertainty. We would look to probably offer a diversity benefit up to, I think right here we have that 97.5% upwards uncertainty requirement. That is what we're proposing in DAME. That is a very high level of uncertainty. That is a 1 in 40 probability of uncertainty materializing beyond that target. I think that to the extent that there's a desire to have higher levels of uncertainty, that's certainly something we can explore. The trade-off, though, is that you start to incorporate true outlier events that are outside of any NERC planning standard or good utility practice for resource planning within the requirement. So before I jump into the linkage, the other thing I'd like to mention is that we would look to reserve transmission to ensure the deliverability of that diversity benefit within the EDAM. This again gets back to that example that if the uncertainty materializes in one area and doesn't in the second BAA, you'd want to be able to transfer that residual extra energy to the BAA that the uncertainty materialized in. So what is the linkage with the pooled EDAM RSC? Imagine, so I described the diversity benefit where it would be set at whatever the EDAM footprint would agree, say 97.5. That means if we go forward to this example, I think this illustrates it. So you have 3 different BAAs. They each have individual imbalance reserve requirements of 600 megawatts, but on a footprint, you have a 500 megawatt imbalance reserve requirement. If you wanted to have a 97.5% confidence interval, the numbers would spill out that you would allocate that pro rata diversity benefit. The BAAs would receive credit based off the size of their uncertainty requirement and would receive new requirements for their imbalance reserves. If you are testing on an individual BAA basis in the EDAM, BAA1 now has 183 megawatts of imbalance reserves rather than the 200 megawatts that equates to that 97.5% confidence interval. This is a much lower amount of imbalance reserves and basically increases the risk of failing the EDAM RSC on a standalone basis. So that's one bound of this problem, is if you have a full diversity benefit that is realized across the entire footprint. The other bound would be if you don't have any diversity benefit. So what if every balancing authority area is separately procuring, in this example, the far left column, so 200, 300, and 100. to the extent that they are separately procuring this requirement, you likely have much, much higher amounts of imbalance reserves, far in exceedance of that 97.5 as you move into a real time as a collective footprint. So that's one, the trade-off there though is that each BAA is not leveraging a diversity benefit, so they're bringing more supply, more forward contracted supply into the EDAM and into the RSC. So the question would be let me see if I can go back. Is there a middle ground where the diversity benefit could be partially allocated, maybe not out that full amount? I think there's two different ways you could do this. The first way would be to have a preset megawatt quantity that the entire footprint agreed upon. So I think if you go forward to this example, the bottom table shows 25 megawatts of additional imbalance reserves that the footprint would agree to not take diversity benefit on, and to pool that as imbalance reserves that could be used to pass the WEIM RSC. So this is the middle ground where you have a fixed quantity of additional megawatts that the entire pool can use to pass the EDAM RSC, or the WEIM RSC. The other method would just be to have a higher procurement target essentially to procure to higher levels across the footprint as a whole. So maybe you procured a 99% as the footprint of the whole. You're allocating out a smaller diversity benefit, but there's more imbalance reserves that then translate into the real-time market and give greater assurance of passing the WEIM RSC. So how does this work, or how would the pooled approach work? The pooled approach would work by taking the entire past footprint of the WEIM RSC and simply making all of those bids and all of the energy schedules and imbalance reserve awards flow into the WEIM to be tested as a whole. And again, if you do this, or doing this to the extent that there's any diversity benefit is probably necessary unless you want to seriously degrade the potential to pass the WEIM RSC from realizing that diversity benefit in the day ahead timeframe. This is a simple example showing of how it would work. So the BAAs each have an energy schedule. They each have imbalance reserve requirements. In the WEIM, the forecast for BAA2 materializes well in excess of what the day ahead for energy schedules and imbalance procurement was. They are then able to leverage the imbalance reserves from the rest of the pool, and the entire pool would pass. The entire pool has sufficient supply to meet the uncertainty that's materialized in the real time, versus the converse would be the standalone BAA approach, where BAA2 would fail because they didn't have imbalance reserves, potentially because they accepted a diversity benefit in the day ahead timeframe. The last thing that I want to touch on before we open it up for more questions would be the failure consequences. The ISO put forward in a straw proposal the concept of only having failure consequences during stress system conditions. So in normal system conditions, if a BAA was resource insufficient, they would be able to cure that resource insufficiency without any penalty through the EDAM. This is done based on the expectation that there is sufficient energy in the EDAM and the bilateral markets so that insufficiency could be cured if needed. We do recognize there may be some potential price differences in the EDAM from doing this due to the nature of the EDAM being an hourly market and the bilateral markets typically being 16-hour on-peak blocks. In stress system conditions, again, we would not look for the EDAM to be used as a mechanism to prevent or to avoid sufficient forward procurement. So we would have optionality where a BAA could utilize the EDAM to cure transfers at penalty prices. The penalty price would be set at the bid cap. If a BAA elected not to use this, they could simply have their transfers limited to the bucket 1 transfers and would have the opportunity to cure the resource insufficiency through the intraday bilateral markets or using other resources or tools at their disposal in the real-time time frame. One of the key questions this concept raises is, what are stressed conditions? Stress conditions look different for BAAs in different parts of the interconnection. I think from a California ISO perspective, these would typically be summer operating conditions, likely in the late afternoon through early evening. I think that may be stressed conditions for a number of different BAAs. There are winter peaking balancing authorities in the interconnection. So to the extent that we think that we need stressed conditions for winter peaking balancing authority areas to not allow winter peaking BAs to utilize the capacity of others, that's something we are open to and would be looking for additional feedback on. Finally, we would want feedback on if any additional consequences would be needed for entities who routinely utilize this functionality in stressed conditions to cure their capacity insufficiencies. So, okay, I think we can open it up for questions. That was a pretty quick overview, but any of the three topics, please feel free to reach out and ask questions to anybody on the panel.
All right, thanks, Danny. So any questions from the room, please raise your hand. All right, Jan, I see you. Raise your hand first. I'll get you, Jeff, next.
This is Jan Starr from San Diego Gas Electric. I just wanted to sort of comment on the demand response topic. To the extent that you're assuming that demand response is essentially reducing the load that's going to be cleared day ahead, it treats that demand response essentially as a price taker on the supply side, right? As if it's willing to take any price, when in fact that could be the most price sensitive demand on the system. So anyway, I don't know if I have an answer for it. I can see the dilemma here, but I would point out it almost seems like you may be going in the opposite direction where we should be going from an efficient market standpoint.
Yeah, I think this is, Jen, this is a concept we talked about in the working groups, and I kind of jokingly named it a proxy demand response, because it'd be a market resource that effectively is a price taker without the metering and telemetry requirements. I think that's an idea that we'd still be open to, and to the extent that stakeholders think that that's a better way to try to account for these types of resources, we can investigate it.
All right, thanks. Jeff?
Jeff Nelson, SCE. Some questions about congestion modeling and just trying to understand what you're saying with the WSPP contracts. So for the sources and known, you're proposing to model the source as sort of the adjacent balancing authority. So let's just say that, I don't know, who touches Nevada? Utah, right? So I'm imagining Utah's got a transfer going into Nevada. So is that sort of?
Yeah, I think that's the general concept, because at least from our perspective, modeling it from Utah is more accurate than anywhere else, because at least you know it's coming through Utah.
So, okay, so then how does the congestion modeling work? Are you going to like distribute that? Let's say it's a 100 megawatt import or something. Are you going to put 100 megawatts of generation distributed throughout Utah's balancing authority?
Yep.
And then I'm just trying to understand. There's no follow-up.
Okay.
And then the question is, should you model the congestion that's created by that 100 megawatt distributed generation? Is that congestion that will be Utah balancing area congestion? Or would that be congestion between the ETSR between Utah and Nevada? What congestion are you talking about modeling?
I think it would have the potential to be modeled as congestion in both. It would be the intra-BAA transmission lines who might see higher flows resulting from that distributed generation. And it would also, the other question is do you model the congestion on the actual scheduling, on the scheduling point itself as part of congestion management to ensure that you're not scheduling so much bucket 1, 2, or 3 volume of buckets 1, 2, or 3 transfers that would be in excess of the flow limit when you also consider the WSPP injection.
So if there is no scheduling point between Nevada and Utah, right? Because you kept using scheduling point, but they've joined and it's completely gone, the interface. If someone has an existing contract that goes from Utah to Nevada, how do they represent that?
Well, they would have to, as part of that contract, know where they take ownership of or title to the power, right? And so typically that would be at their BAA boundary.
Okay, and then you're not quite sure. I'll have to think more about that. And then the last one you said, is there a concern that, and I forget the wording you used, that this might displace bucket 1 transmission? I just didn't understand what you meant by that. So you could elaborate.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So the concern would be we're trying to create a paradigm where people are utilizing buckets 1, 2, or 3 transmission to reflect their contracted supply in different balancing authority areas. If you present an option where you don't have to acquire that transmission to reflect that capacity in a different balancing authority area because it's non-resource specific, did you just devalue the need to acquire that transmission at the BAA boundary?
And just sort of a follow-up, maybe they go hand in hand, maybe they don't. Could you just sort of articulate what the self-scheduling versus the bidding requirement is? So I guess the general plan is only the ISO allows bidding at its boundary on its scheduling points. So, and you're planning on using those bid-in values in the RSC. When do you have to self-schedule these contracts to have them count?
What we're contemplating is these would have to be reflected as a self-schedule prior to running the day-ahead market when we're running the RSC. So we'd see a self-schedule for a megawatt quantity at a certain scheduling point, and then that would be credited in the RSC, and then that would also flow into the IFM.
So at the ISO's border, since you'll take bids, a WSCC contract could just bid into the ISO's market, and its bids would count, and maybe it would clear, maybe it wouldn't in the IFM. But at the other boundaries, it would have to self-schedule.
Yeah, there is the contrast that you're pointing out does exist. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Okay, we have a few other questions. Before we go to the questions here in the room, I do want to jump to virtual. I think we do have a question queued up from Laura.
Yep. Yes. As a reminder, please accept the message to be unmuted. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Laura Trelease with the Energy Authority. Just alongside this whole discussion on bucket 1 transmission and some of these transactions that we're talking about, I know a big part of the concept of bucket 1 transmission and what's written in the paper is that it needs to be firm and conditional firm transmission in order to ensure reliable day-ahead commitment and support confidence in transfers. And so I'm trying to understand what the risk is to another EDAM BA by allowing these types of transactions and using the example, let's say, on non-firm transmission. So if I understand this correctly, if there's an EDAM BA or even a CAISO BA that counts these types of resources that are using, let's say they couldn't get firm transmission, so they end up flowing on non-firm transmission and they get curtailed, and that causes a reliability issue in the BA. Am I correct in my thinking that to the extent that that BA has to shed load and curtail exports, that an EDAM export from that BA would be curtailed pro rata with load? And so then other EDAM BAs are taking on the risk of these transactions being on non-firm transmission or maybe coming from even non-firm energy sources?
Okay, so yes, I think that the EDAM transfers would be equal priority to load, so they would be curtailed pro rata with load. I think the concern you raise is valid. During the working group process, this was discussed, and the feedback we received from most of the parties who utilize these types of contracts is that they've been utilizing these for years, if not decades, and they've been very reliable, and they've experienced very little issues utilizing them. So we're trying to balance their existing operating practice, which does rely on these and has successfully relied on these for quite a while with the risk you just identified.
Okay.
Okay.
Laura?
And then just a follow-up question also on if a BA doesn't pass the resource efficiency test, are they still receiving both the diversity benefit and also the benefit of being pooled for the real-time resource efficiency test?
I think that would depend if they would look to cure their insufficiency through the EDAM. To the extent they would look to cure the insufficiency through the EDAM, I think they would still be they should still be able to participate in the pooled approach in the WEAM. Obviously, if they are unable to cure it through the EDAM, they would not be able to participate in the pooled model in the WEAM.
And then lastly, just as a follow-up on my first question, for the CAISO BA that has had a history of some of these undelivered intertide bids, and what is the ISO planning on doing to ensure that they're not pushing on that risk to other EDAM BAs?
Well, I think in our proposal, we are right now proposing to count these in the RSE as well as to utilize them in the market. But to the extent that entities do not feel like that's the appropriate treatment for intertie bids, we would look for you to give us additional information in your comments about the problems that may create.
Great. And I think that was kind of the example, is to the extent they're not delivered and creates an issue in the CAISO BA, then that risk gets transferred to another EDAM BA in the pro rata curtailment of that EDAM transfer out of the CAISO BA and equal to load. So I think that's really the risk. And so just understanding what steps the CAISO might be taking to ensure deliverability of these intertie bids, I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Laura.
All right, thanks, Laura. So Russ, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Russ Manfeld, BPA. For the maybe a follow-on to Jeff's line of discussion about modeling. So when we say it's distributed to the neighboring BA, so I assume that means like in the power flow, whatever the relative like transmission constraints are, would that be consuming or like be allocated to the constraints in the model, or like exactly how would that work? That it would be modeled as coming from the neighboring BA in like is it in the power flow or?
Yeah. So my understanding is it would be in the power flow. You would look at the resource fleet of the neighboring BAA and distribute small amounts of that injection to those resources.
And would the neighboring BA know? So I guess absent confirming that they have transmission, which I think we said was not going to be the case, is it possible that the neighboring BA could have that sort of consumption of the transmission without being aware of why that was happening? Like, because they may not be privy to this contract.
Yeah. So are you referring to kind of their internal transmission?
Yeah.
I think that this could potentially result in congestion internal to the BAA. However, there's so many drivers in the optimal solution of where that congestion is coming from. It definitely can contribute, but
yeah, I mean, I often take comfort in all the things I don't know as well. So it seems like you could bind on intra transmission inside that BA, creating congestion revenue. Right. And where would that revenue get allocated?
I think that would get allocated I would defer to the.
I can try to do it. So if it's the congestion inside that balancing area, that would be allocated to the balancing area to determine how to allocate it out.
Okay.
If it's congestion on the transfer, then it was per the earlier discussions about, is it 50-50, something in between, or 100%? Depending on the scenario on the transfer.
Yeah, so this will probably be in our comments. I mean, I understand the necessity of using heuristics in a situation like that, but the concept of modeling at the neighboring balancing authority, I think, could create some pretty interesting outcomes. I think also it's important to, I think, colloquially, we typically display BAs as being horizontal and adjacent. In the Northwest in particular, they're vertical in many situations. So, an adjacency is really for interchange accounting. That's kind of the genesis of an ETAG in the first place. So, the notion of a neighboring balancing authority representing physical congestion or a source, I think it's just worth further thought, and we'll think about that in our comments. But yeah, if there's any other insight into that.
I guess as you think about it, think about alternatives that we should consider, because do you model that WSPC Schedule C at the intertide point, which also is not right physically or from a congestion perspective? Do you distribute it to the entire EDAM footprint? That's not exactly right. Or, as Danny indicated earlier, do you eventually evolve those contracts? Maybe they're not source specific, but could they get at least balancing area source specific? So if we had that information, we would certainly endeavor to improve and follow that information.
All right, before I go to the phones, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to make another comment on a related issue to the one that Russ was raising there, which is it strikes me that the concern, Danny, you asked about whether putting a contract in with no transmission into the market and having that potentially displace bucket one, say, which would be firm or conditional firm, that really is a significant issue beyond the modeling. When I sort of step back, that sounds a lot like the wheel through issue that obviously had significant debate, where entities have secured firm service on an external transmission system like the BPA system, are attempting to use those rights to deliver to Southwest, and then the market software in the CAISO displaces that delivery in favor of an import that may be on non-firm transmission on the BPA system or may not even have transmission on the BPA system. And so this issue around the potential for an entity that doesn't have transmission rights to take priority over a firm rights holder is a significant issue from the perspective of ensuring that the out priorities are upheld in the market design. So I do think that that is something that needs to be very carefully considered, because the last thing we would want to see is those types of challenges that were raised in that arena get extended further beyond the CAISO VA into other elements of the market footprint as well.
So on that note, I understand what you're saying. I guess we're looking for some help here to bridge WSPC Schedule C. I'm not sure it's appropriate to say that they don't have any transmission. What we understood is that they couldn't articulate the transmission at the time of the market closure or the source specificity. So do we ignore that altogether, not give them credit when these contracts have historically provided reliable service and may actually have may be coming on firm transmission? So help us understand what the art of the possible is here, because this is one area that we struggle with.
I would just add that, I think everyone, and it was consistent in the discussions in the workshop, that I think there's a recognition that bilateral contracts are important and that entities use those to balance their system. But I think it's also worth noting that the vast majority of WSPP contracts are tagged on a day-ahead basis, and the source of the transaction and the transmission rights can be determined. So I think there's a related but different issue around what supply gets included in the RS test that's separate from this issue around OAT priority. One of the things that we're planning to raise in the discussion later is discussion related to what George mentioned this morning around what is the need for things like base scheduling. And this is one of them, the ability to communicate schedules on high priority transmission and have a means to allow the market optimization to recognize that benefit. And I think that that's going to be part of the equation in terms of finding a solution to ensuring that those OAT priorities are recognized and considered relative to lower quality uses of transmission, or in some cases, potential where there isn't transmission identified.
Thanks, Jeff. I agree with a lot of your concerns. I think on the base scheduling, to the extent that an entity would know the source specificity and all the transmission it's flowing across to accurately represent it in a base schedule, at that point, we could just represent it accurately in the model itself. So it gets back to what is the ability for these types of contracts to evolve? Like Mark said, is there the potential to at least know the BA it's coming from a modeling purposes? And then we can have the discussion about what should be the boundary transmission showings at each BAA boundary between the source where it's coming from and the eventual sink.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Thanks. Question up here in the front. Hit the icon, the little face icon.
Okay.
There you go. You got it.
This is Michelle Keto with the CPUC. So just about the wheel comment, I guess I just would note that the wheels weren't coming through before we changed the rules on the export. So it's a new issue. It wasn't an existing issue. So I just wanted to address that. And then I just wanted to get some clarity with regard to the EDAM and transfer issue. I feel like I'm confused about this. What I hear people saying is that the transfers will be, the exports will be cut at the same time firm load is. But I also heard other folks say that it was the firm transmission that wouldn't be cut. So could maybe somebody explain to me how that works exactly? Because I think in response to the women about TEA, the answer was that we'll cut the exports and load the same. And I don't think that's what I thought CAISO meant.
Yeah, so what we have said in the past was that it's the underlying transmission capacity that is used to schedule transfers in EDAM is what is firm, meaning that it will be there and will propagate to the real-time market if it's used by EDAM. We don't want to see this transmission capacity being recalled. The energy schedule for a transfer that is using that firm transmission capacity, that is just an economically scheduled energy schedule, which is subject to reoptimization in the next market and ultimately the real-time market. So in that respect, energy transfers, they don't have a priority, which is something that we call about self-schedules. It's not a self-schedule, it's not forced in, it's economically scheduled, and therefore you can say it has the lowest priority possible. It's only scheduled if the economics allow it to be scheduled, if it's economic to schedule it. And that means that in the next market, you can have a complete reoptimization of that schedule. I showed you examples where it shows that the next market actually reverts and backs off completely the transfer that was scheduled in the previous market. So you should see it like that. It's the underlying transmission capacity. That's the firm product.
I want to clarify this because that economic reversal is not curtailment of the transfer, and that's not what we were talking about when we get to that emergency condition and we have to, for balancing areas, considering having to shed load. That comes about because there is bids available and transmission available, and it has available to the optimization. That's not what we're talking about in terms of the pro rata allocation if we get into an emergency state or a balancing area gets into an emergency state.
So I guess then we go back to the question that the woman asked from TEA. So if you have an import that's supporting an export, an EDAM transfer to another EDAM entity, but you lose the import, the tie, is that one of those circumstances in which you cut both the export and load, or is that one of those circumstances where you say that's a non-firm export and that gets cut? And I guess that's the trouble I've been having.
It doesn't immediately mean that you shed load or curtail the transfers, because there's a lot of things that, as we discussed earlier, George went through earlier, there's a lot of things that happen before you get to that point, including using the optimal results and the imbalance reserves to absorb that. So
well, I know you hate when I talk about this, but let's assume we're talking about July 9th, where we lost the intertie.
I do hate that.
Yeah, I know you hate that. Okay. So we lost the intertie, and in the first round, what we did was we supported the exports because it was in the market and there were some issues. In the second round, we ended up cutting 3,500 megawatts of exports. So if this were to repeat in the EDAM framework, would we still cut those exports to maintain reliability in California?
In the time frame that we didn't get to the point where we were shutting load in California. So if those were EDAM transfers, those are lower priority exports that got cut. They would still be cut. EDAM transfers would not automatically have been cut because we didn't get to the point where we were shutting ISO load.
And I guess I'm having a little trouble distinguishing between EDAM transfers that are firm and EDAM transfers that are non-firm. So maybe this will be a discussion for another day. So I'll just leave it at that for the time being.
Okay.
But I do have just a couple of other quick follow-ups. Have you guys thought about RDRR? I mean, in your previous slides, you did say that the RDRR would be included, but I've also heard otherwise. And so has your thinking evolved in that?
I think that we would look to include any DR that is bid into the day-ahead market. So to the extent that RDRR is bidding, then yes, it would be included.
Okay. And as you know, we've had discussions about this, and we've asked for the RDRR to be activated at earlier stages. So if it were activated and bidding at 1,000, would you count it?
If it was activated and was bidding at 1,000, it would be counted.
Would you allow it to be activated? Because this is where we've been really having some trouble. So.
Well, and that gets into what is the RDRR product design, and I believe it's supposed to be used in emergency conditions. So can you justify that in a day-ahead time frame that you foresee an emergency condition, which you would need to bid these resources in for?
Yeah, so I guess this is the hard part, right? So you say, yes, you'll include RDRR, but then you say, no, it's an emergency reliability resource, so we won't count it. So that's the struggle I'm having here. Okay, duly noted.
By the way, I think it's eligible for use on alert, not an emergency, strictly.
Yeah, and there's also a segment of RDRR that can participate regularly in the day-ahead market too.
Yeah, and we'd like all of it to be able to participate at a $1,000 bid. But so I think there's room to negotiate here. So then I just wanted to go on to another point, which is that you guys have been talking about the imbalance reserve being able to address our uncertainty, and that's a 5%. So we will expect 5% that it does not address the uncertainty. Is that right?
I think if it's a 95% confidence interval, so if you look at the upward uncertainty, it would be 2.5% of the time.
Okay, so 2.5% of the time that we expect to fail, we will expect that to be during stress system conditions, right?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so you don't think it will be during stress system conditions?
The stress system conditions are high loading conditions, right? So this is what is the uncertainty that can arise from that high loading condition. So I don't think there's a really strong correlation either way about uncertainty arising in stress conditions. I think you can make an argument that you get real true outlier events in stress system conditions. On the other side, you likely have higher levels of uncertainty during days in the spring when you have a ton of intermittent resources on. It's more likely to materialize then.
Right. But in the work that Guillermo did, he showed that the imbalance reserve product mostly didn't cover the RUC operator adjustments during stress system conditions over 40,000, right?
And I think as we've talked about in other venues, there are other things that operators make RUC adjustments for beyond the uncertainty that the imbalance reserve product is trying to address.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle.
There is something else here too that I can add, Michelle. Although the uncertainty that could materialize in a BAA may be in that 2.5% edge condition, it's very unlikely that we'll have the same thing happening to every BAA in the market footprint. So this inherent diversity benefit that the market provides through all the BAAs that participate can even cover the cases where uncertainty may materialize beyond our target in one BAA. And this is one of the examples that I saw where BAAs A and B were helping BAA C when the target went above.
Yeah, I guess my only response to that would be that, people have been looking at when the West has trouble and, they are looking across the entire West. And there is some correlation between when we've all entered into problems and when there's a westwide heat wave, right? So we could expect that is going to be the troubled time, right?
But is the correlation that there's a westwide heat wave, or is the correlation that there's uncertainty that is materializing at a 1 in 40 probability across a 2,000-mile north to south footprint?
Wow.
I guess that's the question, and why we think that this could potentially increase reliability is to the extent that uncertainty isn't perfectly correlated and wouldn't materialize simultaneously. EDAM BAAs would be able to leverage their neighbors' imbalancers or procurement to meet everybody's collective real-time needs.
All right, I thought we were going to gain time, but obviously we're not. So I've got 2 calls on the virtual, and then I'll get to you, Kathleen. So let's go to Tong on the phones.
Sure. As a reminder, please accept the message to be unmuted. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Tom?
Hi, Tom Wu from WAPA. I have some clarification questions regarding Schedule C and Bucket 1. If I understand Danny correctly, the proposal is to not require Bucket 1 for Schedule C. But for Schedule C, I think there are many segments. I may not know the first few segments, but I should know the last segments. Now, for example, if you make a purchase from somebody in Washington, and then I may not know the segments by 10 a.m. from Washington to Oregon. But if my POD is Cobb, now I want to bring power from Cobb to California, I wouldn't know the last segment. So are you suggesting that the people who want to bring power from, say, Cobb to California does not need to show transmission in Bucket 1?
That's what's in the proposal, to the extent that you think that it would be appropriate to show that last segment as Bucket 1 transmission. That's the exact type of feedback we're looking for.
Okay, that's my first question. My second question has to do with the distribution. Let's use the same example. Okay, the generator is in Washington, and you will distribute the Cobb delivery to all the generators in Oregon. And then actually a generator would generate in Washington to supply that power. How do you address the double counting issue? Is there a double counting? Probably that's the details in the model.
Again, let me just, if you knew it was in Washington by 10 o'clock, we would distribute it to Washington. If we don't, I think our proposal is distribute it to Oregon.
I see. So by 10 a.m., I may not know. By 3 p.m., most likely I would know. I'm not sure I would know, but most likely I would know. So when you run day ahead, so what you're saying is that because I need to run the market at 10 and I don't know where it is, and I'm going to just run it. But that generator in Washington would bid into the EDAM as well.
So, Tom, let me try to answer this. This is George Angular. So, and first of all, we can continue talking about states, although, we should be talking about BAAs here.
Yes.
Okay, so let's hypothetically say there's a BAA called Washington, a BAA called Oregon, and then we have so BAA. So you're talking about a WSPPC contract that the ultimate delivery is going to be at COT, right? And you know that it's generated the energy, the source is Washington, okay? And let's say the Washington BAA now have to ask you, is it in EDAM or not? Because that affects the answer.
I see. Well, I don't know whether they're going to be in. Let's assume they're in. Okay, let's assume,
Okay.
Well,
if they're in and you know that it's coming from Washington, then your counterparty should work with Washington BAA to declare a bucket one transfer so that we don't have this double counting of capacity that you're referring to. Because in this particular case, in this example, you know where it's coming from. It's coming from some generator in Washington, so it has to be tied to a bucket one transfer so that we don't double count the capacity. Because the other answer, if you don't know where it's coming from, obviously we cannot stick it to Washington or any other BAA. So we'll say it's coming from a non-EDAM BAA, and you'll see it materializing in COTP, okay? And then for the distribution, that's the other part that Danny said. Obviously, we don't know where to distribute it. So the first guess that we have at this point and what we put in the proposal is that we distribute it in the immediately adjoining EDAM BAA that happens to be Oregon.
Well, I think the problem is that at 10 a.m., I don't know where it is, and I don't need to know. I just know somebody will deliver power to Cobb. And then later on, probably in today's world, people are, making purchases, transmission purchases. They may not even know where the resource, they may not know the transmission, or don't know, they may not know the resource by 10 a.m. They would know later. But in the EDAM market, if this is assumed that generator is in EDAM footprint, that generator would submit a bid, or maybe a collection of generators would submit bids to the market. You would award those generators based on their bids. You don't see the relationship between the EDAM market and the bilateral market. They're in parallel. And so I'm thinking there might be a double counting issue. When you distribute the delivery to some generators in Oregon BA, and then another generator is also generating, and the relation has not been established at 10 a.m. So you run the market.
Right. So
resources.
Right. So Tong, my answer is still the same. And as I said it before, we want to give the benefit of the doubt to the BAA that declares this WSPPC contract for their RSC evaluation. So we want to honor it, even if we don't have all the details for that schedule. But if the participant has the source information and the source happens to be an EDAM BAA, then we expect them to do the other half of the step here, meet us halfway, to please organize, connect with the other BAA, and declare a bucket one transfer so that we avoid this double counting of capacity. We don't see any other way that we can have our cake and eat it too. In essence, have the WSPPC counted in the RSC and not having solution problems by double counting the capacity. Everybody has to work towards achieving that goal.
I see. So maybe some discussion with the WSPP and try to coordinate this might be needed. Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks, Tong. Okay, let's move to Fred on the phone.
Sure. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition, in the hypothetical BA of Oregon. And we're thinking a lot up here in the Northwest about demand response these days, and I appreciate the comments that have already been made and the point that Jan Strack made about the price sensitivity, but there are a couple other issues that are beginning to wonder about, and I actually do have a question. One is the issue that was kind of indirectly alluded to here, which is the relationship between the gas nomination cycle and all the stuff happening on the electric side. By 10 a.m., we don't necessarily know what the gas situation will be. And if you have DR in your pocket that you might bid in if the gas prices go up high enough, all other things out of the way, I'm a little concerned there about holding back DR or saying you've got to commit it a day ahead. The second thing I'm wondering about is the impact on the soft offer cap, hard offer cap situation. And I haven't really thought about this very much, and I'm sure I don't know all the details, but, for example, to what degree any of this will have an impact on the maximum import bid parameter test in determining when the soft offer cap can be raised up to the hard offer cap. So the final point, and I guess my real question is, does the ISO have the view that we should be providing, maybe not, the incentive may not be the best word, but an open, open invitation to resources like demand response to participate as much as possible and provide flexibility for that so that the benefits of DR can be applied when it's really needed?
So Fred, I think this is the second comment we've heard that expresses an interest in the proxy demand response model. So I think we can take that back and try to put out what would be the common understanding, because again, everybody has to agree what this is composed of. There's likely to be limited metering or telemetry on these, so all stakeholders are going to have to be comfortable with these being bid in and being viewed as a market resource. But to the extent we can get there, I don't see any reason why we couldn't try to model these as a third type of DR resource.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we're going to take one more question in the room. Kathleen?
Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. First, I want to say thanks to the CAISO. Between January until now, I think you have moved in a positive direction. So directionally, we're making improvements on this topic. So I want to thank you for considering our comments during the working group sessions. Moving further along with that, I am going to revisit with Tong because I had very similar questions and thoughts along what Tong raised, and I will try to be very succinct. So I heard George, you articulate a mechanism, and I'm going to be very general in how I talk through this because I want to keep it high level and not focus on the technical implementation in the RSE. But conceptually, we have withdrawals and injections somewhere on our system. Some of those withdrawals are going to be in a non-EDAM area. Some of those withdrawals are going to be in BAAs, source BAAs within the EDAM area. I deeply agree with George, your statement that it matters and it's very important where that source is coming from when we're talking about these different import transactions that want to be contributing in the sync BAA to resource efficiency. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume that most of the challenges can be resolved if that source location is in a non-EDAM BAA, whether we are talking non-resource specific or resource specific. And if those sources, however, are coming from an EDAM BAA, I think that's where most of our challenges are. So I'm just trying to focus in on that area. If we're talking about a non-resource specific, I'm not sure that I'm convinced the neighboring BAA is a good default assumption right now. I understand why it's a starting point, and I appreciate that. I think that I'm going to tag off of some of what Jeff Spires from PowerX said, if you don't mind, that I agree that there are some that may know prior to the day ahead market close what their source location is, either is and they have transmission from, or they at least know where they plan to transact if it's something that they are going to make that decision after the market. I think there's a couple of scenarios. So if we work from the scenario that they both know the location and they know the source and they have an E-tag, there is a possibility for the CAISO to allow for those market participants to submit you that information. I think that's one thing we'd like to see considered. If they don't have the tag yet, but they know within, let's say, a 99% certainty what pool they would be transacting at, they can submit that through showing where their withdrawal is going to come from. And I'm not proposing that there be intertie bidding in the EDAM areas in IFM, but there might be some functionality that could be leveraged to reflect this idea of an export from a given BAA and import to another BAA to more accurately model that flow in the RSE so you can see the impact on the source BAA and the sync BAA. And part of the reason that we're concerned about it is we want to make sure that we're not only allowing for that energy, that offer that we expect to show up in the sync BAA, but also ensuring we're not double counting in the source BAA. And if there's ability to submit that information, I'm gonna quote one of my favorite movies, if you build it, they will come. And I think we should be building something for them to submit that. I agree that there needs to be a default. It's something I will think about more for those who don't have that information or show it, and we'll try and provide comments on it. I want to, one more comment on the resource specific. I know it wasn't a part of what you were looking for, but I think it's similar issues. Even if you have a resource specific contract to import into another BAA, we need to ensure that if they are located in an EDAM BAA area, I would anticipate we would see a participating resource offer, and we would see an import showing into the sync BAA. So we also want to make sure that we are reflecting and modeling that export out of that source BAA to offset the participating offer so that we're not double counting. So those are just some things for you to think about as you continue.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think we fully agree to the extent these contracts can evolve and we have some better way to model the energy injections. We are all for that. This is simply the least bad solution that we were able to come up with. But again, we're looking to the stakeholder community to either evolve these contracts or for your input on trying to develop different ways we could try to model these. And to your last concept about resource specific, this kind of touches on the bid range trading concept that we brought up, where it could be offsetting RFC obligations based off arrangements where supply is contracted in a neighboring BAA and the boundary transmission can be shown.
All right. I think we're going to wrap this topic up. It was great conversation. We will have time tomorrow to delve into this a little bit more when we have more time for questions. But thank you, Danny, and thanks for the stakeholders for your feedback and comments. So the ISO staff's going to leave the stage, and I would like to welcome up our first stakeholder panel. I'm very pleased to introduce Jim Baggs, who has volunteered to moderate this panel, and he has assembled a great group of stakeholders to participate and opine on the resource efficiency evaluation. So a little bit about Jim. Jim is the Regulation and Market Development Officer for Seattle City Light. He oversees the market development efforts for City Light, along with his regulatory and compliance responsibilities. So like many of us, he's got a regular job and multiple jobs. Since joining SCL as an officer in 2011, he has served as interim general manager and CEO as well as other executive positions. So he has a very colorful career with lots of professional credentials. But there is one thing I found out about him at lunch. He used to be a rodeo cowboy. And he served as a rodeo clown. So I don't know if that's true. I haven't seen pictures, but maybe that's something we can find out at happy hour. So I am very pleased here to introduce the rodeo clown, Jim Baggs. Thanks, Jim.
So, obviously, I quit that a long, long time ago because I'm still here. So, relatively healthy. So, anyway, thank you, Joanne. Looking forward to moderating this panel to pick up on where we left off in some of the previous conversation. I was, when you get ready to have a panel like this, there's always a little bit of uncertainty about, well, is there going to be enough to talk about? Are there going to be questions? Are people going to have opinions? And if I was at all confused about that an hour ago, I'm not anymore. So I think we should be fine. What I'd first like to do is introduce the panel who'll be having this discussion up here with me. And so let's see, I'll start in order here with John Olson, right here immediately on my left, is the Director of Energy Trading and Contracts at the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And his group is the market-facing entity for SMUD in managing a diverse group of assets, including hydro, thermal, solar, wind, and geothermal in bilateral markets, as well as in the CAISO's Western Energy Imbalance Market. Then next to John, we have Carrie Bentley. She's the co-founder and CEO of Gridwell Consulting, and Gridwell currently provides analysis and strategic support on all things ISO, including transmission, interconnection, capacity, storage assets, and the energy markets. Carrie routinely evaluates and negotiates resource adequacy and power purchase contracts on behalf of both load and supply clients, conducts resource adequacy audits, and testifies on contract disputes. She served as a technical advisor to the first long-duration storage procurement procurement RFO in the country, developed the two-slice RA proposal being considered by the CPUC as a path. Oh, okay. Well, you gave it to me. All right. Anyway, I'll skip that part. Carrie did work, though, began her work in the California area, in the California ISO's market monitoring unit, and then more recently at the ISO had been acting as a lead market design and regulatory policy developer. So welcome, Carrie. Next is Scott Ranzal. He is the Director of Portfolio Management at Pacific Gas and Electric Company. In his role, he oversees management of a wholesale power portfolio for PG&E, one of the largest combined natural gas and electric utility companies in the United States. Scott joined PG&E in 2007 and has held various roles in the energy policy and procurement and finance organizations. Scott holds a master's degree in finance from San Jose State and a bachelor's in communication from the University of Colorado. Next to Scott is Jeff Spires, who is director of within PowerX's West Power Group that is responsible for transacting a wide range of physical wholesale energy products across the West. Jeff also leads an analytics team focused on organized markets and regularly represents PowerX in Western market design and policy initiatives. In 2018, Jeff was a co-lead responsible for PowerX's EIM implementation effort. He's been in the industry for 19 years, and prior to his current role, Jeff worked across a variety of areas at PowerX, including pre-scheduling, settlements, real-time trading, and day-ahead trading. And on the other end of the table from me, as Vice President of Energy Supply Management, Mike Wilding is responsible for directing PacifiCorp's front office organization in commercial and trading activities. Energy Supply Management is responsible for commercially managing PacifiCorp's diverse generation portfolio. This includes the electric and natural gas hedging, term and day-ahead trading, real-time trading, and system balancing. Mike also oversees the company's regulatory net power cost filings. He's been employed by PacifiCorp since 2014 and holds a Master of Accounting from Weber State and a Bachelor of Science in Accounting from Utah State University. So there you have us. I want to start here first by echoing a couple of comments that I heard a little bit earlier in this session today. And that is just to express appreciation about how far this effort has come, this EDAM effort, and culminating in, well, at least at this point, and we're at the straw proposal phase. We've moved a long ways since the ideas were thrown out and before the 3-month-long stakeholder process that most of all of you have participated in along the way. So we're at a point now where we have something real and concrete to talk about. You've heard this morning, and well, you've read the straw proposal and then heard some of the previous conversation this morning and immediately here after lunch, and particularly about resource sufficiency evaluation. What we intend to do here is have kind of an informal dialogue among some of the stakeholders that are, likely participants and or impacted by how this entire effort turns out. And hopefully, we may not have, we won't be available for the same kind of Q&A that that the ISO just had right before us, but if possible, we may have a little bit of time at the end if people have questions that are relevant to a stakeholder impacted by this. So, again, this isn't highly orchestrated. I hope and I anticipate that we're going to have some interaction among our panel members along the way too. So, maybe I'll just start by throwing out a question for the panelists, and let's start at the other end just for fun, Mike. Just why is it that just the topic of resource sufficiency evaluation is so important? Why is it the most, one of the most important aspects of the overall day-ahead market design?
Yeah, thanks. It took me a minute to figure out how to work this. I think the resource efficiency evaluation, I mean, at the risk of being Captain Obvious up here, if we're all going to go in this together, if we're going to go into EDAM footprint together, and we have to have confidence that each of us have the ability to serve our load, and that if, any single BA gets in trouble, that does not cascade to the rest of us. So I think just from an overall perspective, like I said, kind of 30,000 foot view, is just if we're going into a market together, we have to have confidence in each other.
Great, thanks. Anything you would add, Jeff, to that?
Thanks, Jim. I think, as Mike kind of alluded to, I think the number one priority pretty much across the West is reliability. And for PowerX and a large number of other entities in the West, that really is a focus on the RAP program, on the Western Resource Adequacy Program, and seeing that through. And so, one of the areas of concerns that we have when we're looking at EDAM and market design is whether the design can be compatible with the RAP program. And the reason I say that is the EDAM is in a unique and challenging position of starting from two different RA program footprints coming together and attempting to have a single market solution that includes both of those two different footprints. And so when I say that, I think it's a reasonable assumption that a significant majority of the participants in an EDAM would either be part of the RAP or part of California's RA program. And that's inherently a difficult place to start from for a market design, because we are in effect combining two different RA programs that are achieving different levels of reliability. And our understanding, based on a lot of the discussion this morning, is that the EDAM would effectively pool the resources within those two RA footprints together in the operating time frame, and then assign equal priority of the supply to the load across that broader two RA footprint. And so our concern is, will the rules be designed in a way that complements RAP or not? And will the RAP members be able to benefit from the priority access that they expect to receive by participating in that program? And so, absent a common RA program that is underlying a market, it leads to challenging market design rules like resource sufficiency that we have to be thoughtful about to try to get right to address some of those fundamental challenges of not having a common RA standard. And that's where we get to when we start talking about a day-ahead resource sufficiency test and some of the challenges around that.
Can I jump in there? Is that okay?
Go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. And I think that goes back to if you're going to have two different RA, especially in the RAP, we talk about that forward showing period that is, 7 months out. And in EDAM, we're looking at, the 45 days out. And so you have these different underlying RA programs. In my mind, that does create challenges. I agree with you there. And that's where we need to have confidence, and we need to be able to see that, those, in both directions, that the RA program that may be different, that each entity or BA might be subject to, provides that confidence to the rest of the footprint, even if they are different. Now, I think where in the RAP design, in the Western Resource Adequacy Program design, especially in that operational period, it was intentionally designed to interact with a day ahead market, and specifically the timing is really works out well, where at 5 a.m. on the day ahead, the participants in the Western Resource Adequacy Program will either request help from the program, or they would be required to hold back capacity for the next day for the program. And I think the RAP design document even talks about that, how because of that timing, there's minimal coordination that's needed. However, I completely agree that we do need to have that confidence in each other's RA programs in order to move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And let me, as long as we're coming down the line this direction a little bit, let me turn to Scott for a second there. I mean, just a reminder here, and my utility is the participation in the Western Resource Adequacy Program as well, and we certainly look forward to the success of that program. But the goal of this particular effort here is the EDAM. And so what we're looking at is how can we, with our resource adequacy program or programs as they may be, ensure that the day ahead market that's being proposed here is really successful. And Scott, let me turn to you a little bit as a within California ISO footprint utility with a resource adequacy program in place. How would you respond to what we were just hearing about resource adequacy and its relationship to resource sufficiency evaluation?
Thank you. I think some of the points that Mike and Jeff made are important. You are combining something new here. Resource sufficiency is going to be critical to that because the planning activities that exist not only in RAP, but in California and all the other entities that are considering participating in it are different. They're using different paradigms, they're using different time horizons, and you have to bridge those planning exercises. The resource sufficiency test is a critical step in order to actually achieve a successful operating paradigm and provide reliable service. I've heard no argument in this room about anybody in here saying they don't want reliable service. The question becomes, how do we get to that? How do we get to that, and how do we define it? And I think one of the important parts about respecting the programs is, and I need to see in the resource sufficiency evaluation, is transparency. How is that resource sufficiency evaluation being executed? How is it aligning with and working with the existing RA programs, whether it be RAP or the California program or any other planning program? And ensuring that the information that's fed into the market, the resources that are going to be available to the market, can ultimately provide in that operational timeline reliable service. Right. Not an easy task, no argument there, but there's plenty of really smart people here working on this problem. And I do think while it has its challenges, it is a solvable problem.
Right. Okay, maybe unless you want to comment further on that, Carrie, maybe, why don't you go ahead and do that first, and then I'll shift gears a little bit.
So I want to go a little bit different of a direction than y'all did. I think we got twisted around on RS and RA a little bit because the CAISO proposed changes to the RA rules at the same time they proposed the RS. And I think they fulfill very different functions. You go back to the purpose of RA, it's not just for reliability, but it's also to have a must-offer obligation so LSEs can enjoy each other's benefits and diversity. So like George was saying earlier, everyone needs to bid in not just the bare minimum of RS, but all their resources in order to enjoy diversity benefits. That's true within an RA program itself. We don't plan daily. We plan monthly. Most ISOs actually plan, across a seasonal or even yearly outlook. And everyone still has a must offer obligation not to bid in that daily forecast, but to bid in the full amount. And the purpose of that is a market purpose just as much as a reliability purpose. So I think that interchange between RA and RS is getting a little bit mixed up because everyone can still enjoy their own RA programs, and the higher your reliability is on normal, unstressed days, the more benefits to the market. And we really only start caring about your RA program is 1 in 10, mine's 1 in 5 on those stressed condition days. And I really do think we can develop fair rules around it. So I completely agree with Scott. This is a tractable problem that we could solve. Thanks.
Great. Maybe I'll shift gears with John a little bit. John, let's shift just into we've all digested the straw proposal, and have some thoughts about what seems to be done the way it should be and other things that you might look at and go, ooh, I wish that were different. So can you talk to us about what aspects of the current EDAM straw proposal you think are defined the way they really should be?
Thanks, Jim. I think on the surface, the thing that jumped out at me as I read through the straw proposal was, I think we talked about it. It came up a number of times in working group, is not to let perfection be the enemy of good. And I think there's some details that need to be worked out yet, but they navigated through a lot of stuff to be able to get this into a document. As you heard Mark say earlier, a readable document. I really didn't know what to expect when I got the straw proposal. And it was much easier to read than I ever anticipated it to be. It didn't, from a transparency standpoint, it was there because it didn't hide the issues. I mean, GHG, for example, there's seeking input on 2 different potential paths. Both of them are fairly different. I think they can be workable, and I'm sure people will have entities will have their preferences, but at least they highlighted that. And I thought they did a decent job of trying to bring those perspectives forward. But if you got done sitting through the months or 6 weeks worth of sessions on all 3 of those work groups, to have it boiled down to the straw proposal it did, I think they did an outstanding job of doing that.
Sounds good. Thank you. For the resource sufficiency evaluation component in particular, Carrie, what is there anything that jumped out at you as a deficiency or something that you would identify as, gee, this is something that's either missing or done or proposed in such a way as to feel wrong or inappropriate to you?
Well, I wouldn't say anything was inappropriate in the paper. I'm
right,
used to
wrong word.
Yeah. Totally good. I'm used to a lot longer of stakeholder papers, so I agree with you. This one was a quick read compared to many of the ones I've written before. The one thing, though, that jumped out at me in this particular section where I would have liked more discussion is how the RS can fulfill its dual purposes. One for GHG and one for reliability. To me, just a little bit more discussion on that would have been useful, because whenever you have one functionality serving dual roles, I think you have to make trade-offs. And there really was a lack of discussion around the different trade-offs. An example of this would be not modeling transmission in the RS test. I could see that if you're using the RS test just for the GHG counterfactual, I'd want to model transmission, but maybe there's some real good reasons why you're not proposing to do that. But just that sort of discussion I thought was a little bit lacking.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go down to the end again. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, thanks. And a lot of, our concerns have been brought up already. And some of it is just, switching and moving into a new world for PacifiCorp. We've been bilaterally trading forever, as a lot of BAs and entities here have. And so, the timing of the natural gas optimization and the trading day for natural gas. And for an entity that doesn't have a lot of natural gas storage, we're going to have to figure that out, and we might need some help. Also think about the transmission tagging and the pre-schedule that, there's a lot of discussion around and understand the complications there, and that, we're going to have to figure some of this out as we move from, kind of a bilateral world to an organized market world, or at least a day ahead market. And so for PacifiCorp, it was those things that we're really looking at, and but a lot of that is kind of tuning up our own shop.
Sounds good. Jeff, what would you add?
I think it's always useful to take a little bit of a step back and try to ask ourselves what we're trying to accomplish with something like resource efficiency. And, in my mind, there's really two fundamental elements. We just talked about the fact that we don't have a common RA program that you would typically expect to see for underpinning an organized market. So without that, resource efficiency is one of the key elements that's necessary from a reliability point of view to ensure that the whole footprint has enough supply. And it's really another element that ensures that all of the entities bring their fair share to the table before the day ahead market. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen in the EIM and even in our discussions on the day ahead test is that even a perfectly accurate test doesn't resolve a shortfall. You can't easily address that at the last minute. If you're in the day ahead in real time operating time frame, and there's an entity that's short, that's damaging for the whole market footprint, regardless of what you do. And in my mind, what I think we've come to is that that's why we critically need strong incentives to pass the test and to show up at the time of the test with enough supply, which means every entity should clearly see the need to meet the test and should be incented to take the steps that they need to ahead of time to meet that test. And so from a design point of view, that there are three areas that are critical to that. The accuracy of the test, ensuring that entities that don't pass resource efficiency, to the extent that they do receive energy from the entities that do pass, that should be lower priority. So if there is a problem, the entities that didn't show up resource efficient are the first to be curtailed. And lastly, strong financial incentives that aren't about charging someone a high price for the sake of it. They're about sending the right incentive to avoid that situation in the first place, show up resource efficient, ensure that everyone has a common understanding that that's the goal going into the market so that we're confident in the solution, we have a reliable outcome, and from an equity point of view, the participants feel comfortable that their neighbors are bringing their fair share.
If we, and I agree with that. I mean, we are looking at reliability impacts, and as Kerry pointed out for us a minute ago, there's really multiple purposes, at least dual, if not more purposes to the resource efficiency evaluation that we're going to rely on in the day ahead time frame. So that's critically important. So what about consequences? I mean, Danny and others talked for a while earlier about consequences, and the CAISO, as in the straw proposal, asked for some input on some of the proposals that are out there for the consequences of failure of the resource efficiency test. So, Scott? What's your thinking about the consequences proposal?
Sure. So, I would start by saying our ability to sit here and discuss how we can support each other and change the existing failure consequences that exist from the WEIM to broaden the support of the footprint is evidence of growing confidence in the capability to do it, right? No argument, it's a challenging area, but it's an expression of growing confidence that people want to be involved in a market. They understand that there's a diversity and capability in that market that provides them an opportunity to Jeff's point, everybody needs to show up to that market sufficient. They need to do the best effort. There's going to be a day where that is not possible, and someone needs to be able to utilize that market to help them get through that. It shouldn't be every day. It shouldn't be a long-term activity. And I think as people go through the effort to express their intent, I do believe that they're carrying with them the idea, I want to be resource efficient and I want to provide not only what is required for the test, but to Carrie's point, more than what might be available in the test, if that can provide a mechanism that allows the market to function more effectively. And we should all, ultimately benefit from that activity.
Right. Carrie?
I'll just say I'm not a huge fan of the hurdle rate approach. I would prefer to have strong price formation where the price signal itself is if you have to purchase power at a high price, I think that's maybe a more appropriate price signal. I also think it would be worthwhile to take another step. I really thought the CAISO did a good job saying, okay, here are normal conditions, here are stressed conditions, but stressed conditions can mean a lot of things. It can mean you're near scarcity, it can mean you're near AS scarcity, it can mean one BAA is sufficient, but everyone else is long. So I think actually getting into those details and doing it transparently, to Scott's point, will be really important to maintain the confidence in the program.
Gentlemen, yeah. Please.
One thing to add to that, I think we're all kind of zeroing in on the same issue or similar issues. At the end of the day, there's only a handful of hours, maybe even over several years, that really matter in this kind of thing. And I'm not trying to diminish that, but my point is that's when all of this is going to get stressed by that definition. And Carrie, I agree with you. I think we need to have some really good definitions around some of these topics on what are we actually talking about when we're talking about stress conditions and what would be normal, just so that from a transparency and expectation standpoint, we know how to operate. I do think too that when that day does happen, and that all of us don't want to have happen, but if there's an event that we have to sort through, this could be one of those moments where we're going to have to, as a market, be reflective and be able to understand what went well and what didn't and what changes have to happen. Every market has to be able to evolve in its own beyond this. So I do think that, we're going to do our best at trying to get this right the first time, but this is probably every time there'll be something will be a reset of some sort or reconsiderations needed.
Let me pull up. Thank you. The concept of stressed is put out there before us and it makes sense sort of in concept, but it's not defined. And I think input on what actually really constitutes stress conditions for the purposes of the dam transfer would be useful to the ISO and others. Do you have a perspective there, John, on how you might propose to define something like that?
Well, I think I'll take the easy part of the answer. I'll take the easy part to answer. I think the thing I did appreciate in the proposal was that in normal operating conditions, you can just flush away a lot of issues and just saying, hey, collectively, everything is fine. Some entity, some portion might be stressed in their own definition of stress, but collectively, there's not an issue. It's when that stress is stressing the entire footprint or that entire market. So I think that those definitions, I'm assuming you're going to have to work. I think part of the difficulty in this is, as an entity outside the California ISO bank, as a participant in the bank, we have our own reliability metrics that we need to be able to manage to. And I think that in those stressed conditions, and for a working title or for a working definition, I'll just say on those days where you're near peak of your system, some weird things are going to maybe happen. Those are the times when entities that are not part of the CAISO BAA are going to have to withhold some of their energy to be able to meet their uncertainty for the next day from a BA perspective. And so I wonder what will happen. I wonder how much difference there'll be on a normal operating day on the amount of generation that's available to the market, and what happens when we start getting to a peak, how much generation is going to be available. I don't know the answer to that. I just think that that's something that we'll be thinking about is, are people having to withhold withhold is not meant from a standpoint of market manipulation. It's meant to be able to serve my BA needs for tomorrow.
Right. Makes sense. And that's certainly true of in the current design, the BA functions are going to reside with lots of us, throughout the market. So what you've described is probably true for a number of entities that have their own reliability considerations and obligations as a balancing authority area. Carrie, what about you?
Well, I'm an economist, not an engineer, so I don't know if I'm the right person to talk to about.
That's why I asked you. I'm an economist too.
Yeah, reliability standards. But maybe I'll put a little fun twist on this. And let's say we have the same reliability standards, and then someone else chooses not to, or actually, we choose to have the same reliability standards, and then to no fault of that BAA, they start having outages, or they start becoming less reliable. Do we treat them differently than if they had a lower reliability standard to begin with? Does fault play into this at all? And I think that's an interesting question, because the paper keeps saying we want to incent people to have a high reliability standard. We want to make sure people do the right things. Well, what if everyone does the right thing and over again, we have wildfires in California, and so we can't maintain our 1 in 10. Should we be cut off from EDAM? Should we have consequences for that? So I actually think it gets quite nuanced at some point.
Yeah, fair enough. Other thoughts from the group?
I guess I think that's a really interesting question and good question. And I guess I go back to what John was saying, that there will be points where we will have to course correct and reevaluate, and maybe last year's 1 in 10 does not next year's 1 in 10. And if the same thing keeps happening over and over again, we probably need to make some changes. And so I think those are really good points. And like I said, opportunities to reset and look at it afresh that we'll have to do many times in the future.
Okay, great. Joe?
I think we've had some good discussions around failure consequences lately in the context of the EIM as well. And I think there's a broad recognition that, if somebody's in trouble, we don't want to see, to the extent that other entities have surplus supply available, someone being cut off unnecessarily. And I think some of those conversations in the context of the EIM were helpful. But on the other hand, I think, as I mentioned before, one of the things that we really think is important are the incentives to take those steps ahead of time to pass the sufficiency test. And that's where having well-defined financial consequences come into play, as well as I mentioned before, the concept that if somebody doesn't take those steps, shows up short, and ends up receiving energy from the entities that did, that they would be assigned a lower priority. So to the extent there isn't enough supply to go around, the entity that didn't bring their fair share is the first one that would have to face the curtailment, to the extent that not all the demand could be met. But the one thing that John mentioned that is part of the challenge with this is it is likely to be a small number of hours in which system conditions are tight, and this really matters. And that goes back to the incentive between longer-term contracting, building a new resource, securing capacity for the summer to be able to be prepared in advance for those types of situations, as opposed to paying a fee in a small number of hours on a critical day. And that's always the trade-off with this. I think from PowerX's point of view, we would be open to discussing in more detail the concept of escalating penalties that are different depending on how tight the system is, et cetera. But it has to start with conceptually an agreement about what we're trying to achieve, and a recognition it's critical that people pass.
You mentioned EIM as a part of this conversation. What about the concept of the pooled resource sufficiency notion that's in the straw proposal, the pooled WEIM RSE component, and somehow sharing and benefiting from the diversity there? I mean, after all, the consequences, the hours that we're talking about, we're hoping are few, and they're going to be fewer if we have a market situation with a number of us participating in it than they would be for us individually, for sure. But what about the pooled concept that's in the straw proposal, Jeff?
I think in an ideal world that if an entity had done everything they needed to up front before you arrive at day ahead, that ideally you would enter that operating time frame without having to be reassessed for sufficiency later. So you after the day ahead market runs, having a reassessment in real time with new information after you've turned your resources over to the market dispatch, it has some complexity, and I think it would be ideal to avoid that. And certainly, to the extent there are diversity benefits, we want to capture those. I think, though, that on the other hand, I think the concern I have without having enough information to understand that is back to what I said before, which is when it really matters, how do the entities that are participating in the RAP know that they're getting the benefit of that program? And that means that in that operating horizon, they have the ability to count on those resources to meet their load on a priority basis. And so I have some questions around how pooling EIM or pooling EDAM resources across these multiple RA footprints fits in with that concept. And so, I think more discussion in that area is definitely needed to make sure that those different details work together.
Okay, thanks. Scott, what do you have thoughts on the pooled WEIM RSE concept? Again, you have a different RA program here. But I think the question's valid. Regardless of what resource adequacy perspective you're bringing into the discussion.
Yes, I have some thoughts. I think that trying to identify ways to bring a diversity benefit makes sense to me. That said, I do share a little bit of the concern around how that manifests itself and what it ultimately means to operations. And again, I go back to my statement before of if there's a transparent understanding of how that pooling will work and the actions that it will take if it's insufficient, that helps recognize actions that each participant can take to deal with the circumstances that they're dealt with. To John's point, in a stress day, they're going to have to maintain a reliability standard. All of us are going to have to take actions. And I think that transparency is critical, not just offering up we economically all benefit by managing things together. That's only as good as until someone's harmed. And then the second that someone's harmed, it starts to bring that into question. So it needs to be a very clear process that allows the participants to see how that benefit is actually affecting not only pricing, but the markets itself. And that'll be super important.
Okay, thanks. Maybe let's shift gears a tiny bit here. We had a fair amount of discussion right immediately prior to this on several of the issues, but one of which had to do with the types of resources that people are bringing into the resource sufficiency evaluation. And as Danny explained earlier, the proposal, the straw proposal that's out there right now, has come up with a way to accommodate sort of a long-standing tradition in the West or a history in the West of reliance on the WSPP Schedule C contracts. And by, those of us that have used them for a long time would argue that they're real, they're strong, they're good. We rely on them. We should find a way to accommodate them. On the other hand, if you're trying to put together a market and optimize a solution within a certain time frame, they don't fit very well. So the proposal is out there to accommodate them. Let me ask you, John, how do you think the reliance on Schedule C, one, do you think we should allow them to be relied upon in the way that the straw proposal approaches it, or do you have any thoughts about, some of the other questions that came along about how they get recognized in the resource sufficiency evaluation?
And thanks, Jim. The most basic answer initially is, I can't imagine all the entities in the West being able to participate without utilizing that product. It would require a full wholesale change of how we've transacted in that near and mid term of transactions to be able to get your resource stack correct. However, having said that, I share the perplexed notion around how best to do that, because we had that conversation about which BA to spread that distribution to, and I don't know how to answer that. I think it's a novel concept to say, can we evolve the product in a way that we can get some certainty, whether that's to the true generating source or at least to a BA level. Maybe. To be honest, I haven't put that much thought in that because hadn't really occurred to me, to how to extend that back. But I think Schedule C or its potential successors is going to have to be a fact of life in the West of some sort. In this construct, that crosses BAs and, I don't know how else the market would work.
Right.
So,
yeah. Carrie, do you have
any questions?
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I mostly just agree with everything John said. It's a problem. We'll have to figure it out. And as contracts evolve and as we would get more comfort in the market, I think the CAISO would do a better job of modeling them. We'd all have more confidence. Are you going to ask about imports? Economically bid imports, because I think that's the more interesting question, frankly. Yeah, I was really surprised out of everything in reading the CAISO's paper that just intertie economic bids, it seems to be not even resource specific, not RA, get to count toward the RS test. So how I would say that kind of in my world is we're going to rely on spot market purchases for reliability. And that's been something that I think the CAISO has been against for quite some time. So I was really surprised to hear that. And I think that's something that we should talk a lot more about. I think WSPP Schedule C has a long history of being firm. I can mostly say that for economic imports, but I don't think I can say that with the same level of certainty. And I know a lot of other people have concerns about that. So I think that's maybe a more hot button topic.
Sure. Yep. Scott, what thoughts on the intertie bid or any of the other specific resource treatments for resource efficiency?
I would just say, I think to John's point, they're both fundamental pieces of the way in which it works today. And ignoring that fact has a lot of consequence and cost and impact on reliability. And it seems like, albeit a challenging problem, it needs to be worked through, because the market dynamic that would be created if you ignore that seems like a much bigger problem than trying to figure out the math to get the counting and the movement around the region and the grid appropriate.
Sure. Okay. Jeff, how about you on it? Let's come back to Carrie's suggestion or the point she brought up about intertie bids.
I mentioned this before, but I think everyone would largely agree that, bilateral transactions under WSPP or other contracts are something that everyone uses to balance their system, and that those types of transactions should be included conceptually in any test. I don't think that the issue, though, is should WSPP get included or not. The issue is should paper capacity contracts get included. That's the fundamental issue. And the issue that is in detail is whether it's a self-scheduled import or an intertie bid, it's whether the source or transmission has been identified or not. That is the problem. This is, in our view, one of the most significant issues with the SRA proposal around the accuracy of the test, which is the concept of permitting supply to be included that has no source or no transmission identified, even by the end of the day-ahead scheduling timeframe. So set aside some of the we had a discussion earlier about modeling and some of the challenges. I recognize there are complexities there that we would have to navigate, but this is about something more fundamental, which is counting on a resource that isn't there. There's no transmission to deliver it. And the background on this, just so that there's an understanding of what goes on, is there is a history, specifically with the CAISO, where entities submit a bid, they wait to see if they receive a market award. If they do, they call around, try to buy it in the spot market, sometime in real time. If they don't find it, they don't show up. And the challenge with that, of course, is that the CAISO won't know whether or not it will show up or not until as late as 20 minutes before the hour. And so this is a long-standing issue. DMM reported on some of these issues multiple years ago. CAISO operators, there was a presentation about some emergency conditions that were driven by failures of intertie deliveries on critical days a handful of years ago. There was recently a FERC enforcement action on an entity that was engaging in these types of activities. And this is something that the CAISO recently just addressed in the EIM, which was a significant improvement, which was to require an E-tag to be confident that if you're counting on import supply, it's actually supported by a resource. And so in our view, there is just no reason there's no reason that an entity can't tell you where the supply is coming from or what the transmission is unless they don't have it. And there's a really simple solution, which is require a day-ahead E-tag by 3 p.m. It doesn't address all the timeline issues. I recognize the test is 10 a.m., 3 p.m. is several hours later, so there's still complexity there. But at a minimum, we should not be going into the real-time market unclear about whether the supply being included in the test was actually physically there or not. That does not make sense to me. And I think that would be a very straightforward requirement, and it would fit perfectly well with the existing bilateral transactions, the existing approach for WSPP Schedule C. People expect to have a day-ahead E-tag. So I think that's one obvious area that would be a significant improvement over the current proposal.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I think that's an interesting solution, and you'd have to come up with what would we do if you don't have that E-tag in place by 3 o'clock, and I think that could potentially for the intertie bids as well without a source specific. But I think that goes to show, for PacifiCorp, we look at this, we see something workable. We see something that doesn't have all the answers that, obviously we need to have some discussions. I think somebody said there's a lot of smart people in this room, which I agree with. And so as we have these discussions, we can get to a place that will work. And as we, continue on, and we'll have to have moments of reevaluation. And I like a lot of what you said that doesn't inspire confidence if we're relying on paper capacity or capacity that's not there. But I think there are some solutions out there that we can get to and that we can work with. And I think the incentives, you're absolutely right. The incentives have to be there that, no one is leaning on the market long term, that we're incentivizing, having that actual capacity. But from my perspective, this is a, workable proposal, maybe some tweaks, some things that we have to solve, some open questions, but definitely workable.
Quick question maybe, and I'll ask this, Jeff, what you suggested in terms of the timing changes and the certainty associated with the resources ahead of time. It struck me as you were talking that a Schedule C contract, as certain as most of us think they are, have that same problem with them depending upon the time of day. And so did I understand that maybe we find a way around that by rather than having flexibility in terms of the degree of certainty of the resource, by changing the timing instead, so that we do get to a point where we have more certainty?
I certainly think that commercial practices will evolve as markets develop. But the fundamental point I am making is that in today's world, if you make a bilateral transaction, the expectation is that you're going to see an e-tag by the end of that day-ahead scheduling timeframe, and that covers the vast majority of transactions, and it gives confidence to the buyer that they're actually getting something. If they don't see that, they're not going to continue to do that transaction, right? And that's how it works today in the bilateral world. But there is this looming issue that has a long history of significant quantities of supply that fails to show up in the CAISO BA, and it's not known until the very last minute. And it just doesn't make sense to me to include that supply without saying, look, the expectation is by the end of that day-ahead time frame, you can show what that resource is and how it's being delivered. It's not perfect. It doesn't address all the complexities we discussed earlier today, but it gets us closer to that confidence that the supply being counted is legitimate.
Jeff, can I ask one question for clarification? So in the example you're referring to, are you including WSPP Schedule C in that, or is that more of the intertie bid stuff, or is there a differentiation there?
It really is both. It's sort of independent from what type of contract it is. It's just the fact of the matter of, is there a tag that validates that that's really supported by something or not? Okay.
All right, we're getting close to the end of our time. Maybe what I'll do here is give each of you a chance to say one sort of parting thing about your reaction to the specifically about the resource efficiency component of the straw proposal, something that you'd like to throw out there for the ISO and the other stakeholders to hear. So, John, let's start at this end.
Okay. I guess I thank everybody for the work, everybody that went into the work groups, individual interaction, and what the CAISO has done with this. As far as going forward on RSE, I think that there are a number of things we've got to kind of get figured out. I think the thing in the back of my mind being outside of the CAISO BAA is, that confidence on what do we talk about for transfers, day ahead schedule, supporting resources, which is kind of a commingling, or commingling is not the right word, but you have to utilize two mechanisms, the intertie bids to go export out of the CAISO, as well as counting it for our RSE for the next day. So I think I don't see anything that makes me want to say, hey, hold on here. But I think that as we develop these markets, we've got to pay attention to that. But that confidence is probably one of the bigger things in my mind.
Okay. Carrie, you pointed out a couple of things already, and what else, or do you want to emphasize one or both of those?
Sure. I would just say I would like to emphasize that I actually think all the issues within the RS test are solvable. I think some of the other aspects of EDAM are more challenging, and it was really nice to see a portion of the paper that I actually think, yeah, it'll take work and we have to work through the issues, but we can work through them and gain confidence in each other. And then I would just emphasize the connection between RS test and price formation, and not lose sight that incentives, yes, come through the RS test and penalties, but they also come through prices. And you are using the same bid stack in both, and it's important to always keep that connection in your mind, I think, because it is reliability through markets, not in isolation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just finish by echoing a lot of what John and Carrie have said. I think the importance of the RS test is critical to the market functioning appropriately and showing that confidence in the market and ensuring that resources are there to deliver allows the rest of the process to flow through. And I actually think, to Carrie's point, there are challenges in the RSE. They are not insurmountable challenges. There are other areas that seem harder to me.
Great. Jeff, what about you?
There was a lot of discussion in the workshops and before that about ensuring that the EDAM design doesn't infringe upon resource adequacy. And I understand that, but I think it's also, really important that the market design contemplates those programs and ensures that the entities that are coming together to participate in an RA program, seeking the benefits of the diversity and the pooling of resources that provides, have an avenue to benefit from the program the way they're expecting. And then secondly, because the market design is contemplating multiple RA programs or multiple segments of the footprint, the resource sufficiency test is critical in terms of both reliability and economic equity. And that really requires thoughtful consideration of all the things we've been discussing here today to get that right.
Great. Thanks. Mike?
Thanks. Yeah, a lot of pressure. You got to start and end.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think there's a lot of agreement, a lot more agreement than there's disagreement. We can, completely agree that these are issues that we can work through on resource sufficiency. We see this as a load serving entity, looking out for our retail customers as a way to reliably serve them, but also economically. There's a lot of benefits that can be unleashed here for our retail customers. And so, and then I do think it is important that those of us that are members of the Western Resource Adequacy Program, that we get the benefits from that program. But I also see that the EDAM can work with the RAP program. And so I'll leave it there.
Okay. I would like to just thank everybody on the panel. Hopefully this has been useful and a little bit helpful information for the folks that are trying to dial this proposal in, which is really probably all of us in this room and on the phone. It's not just the ISO that's proposing this. There's been a ton of stakeholder input here. Ultimately, it's all about improved reliability for the West and the customers that we all have in our various balancing authority areas. So thanks for listening to us, and thanks panelists for being here.
So Jim, you may have been a really good rodeo clown, but you were a fantastic moderator. So thank you very, very much. Thank you, John, Carrie, Scott, Jeff, and Mike. Thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause for this great group. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, a quick 10-minute break. Please be back here at 3:40. We do have cookies and some sugar snacks out in the atrium area, so please help yourselves. 10 minutes so we can try to get a little bit more back on track. Thanks. All right, I think we're gonna get ready to get started again. If everybody wants to take their seats. Grab a cup of water, glass of water. Hopefully everybody's had a little bit of sugar, a little snack. So I know many of you were admiring Mark Rothleader's socks today. So you will find a pair of socks out in the lobby that each of you can take. They are the ISO logo socks, and they're pretty cool. And I can tell you, even for the women, when I wear my pair, I get lots of great compliments. So I highly recommend those socks. So they're out on the table in the lobby. So stakeholders, please help yourselves. ISO staff, you already have a pair, so no double dipping. I only have enough for stakeholders. Okay, so enjoy. Yes, Scott gives it a thumbs up. All right, we're ready to get to the next focus discussion, which is transmission commitment in the EDAM. And so I'm going to turn it over to Partha, who's going to walk us through this discussion. We've also got James Lynn virtually. So James, can you confirm you're on? James, do we have you on audio?
James, could you
There's
please?
There's a delay there.
Right,
I can
there
hear
you are. Okay, we got you loud and clear. All right, so Partha, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the chance to sort of continue the discussion that we started earlier in terms of transmission participating in the day-ahead market. And before we start going through the slides, I thought I'd first acknowledge the fact that obviously a lot of these topics that we're addressing here in this series of discussions have overlapping issues, and that we certainly received sort of substantial feedback and questions regarding bucket one transmission and how it might relate to the WSPP Schedule C contracts and some of the issues there. And we also heard feedback as well, just in terms of that bucket two transmission and what some of the implications might be associated with, particularly if unscheduled transmission is made available to the market, where so that some of the consequences and implications associated with making that type of transmission available. So first, I just thought I'd acknowledge that. We certainly are looking to get feedback and perspectives on both of those topics. I think that those are certainly critical and important items. For the sake of this discussion, we really were going to kind of shift over to that bucket three transmission to have most of the discussion be focused on that. The reason being, I think the primary reason is that we really did have on the bucket one and bucket two discussions, we had robust feedback via the workshops. And so most of the issues that were discussed earlier, or at least challenges that we had heard before and did our best to address, but we are really looking for feedback on those topics as well. So jumping into the slides. So this is really sort of on bucket three transmission. This is really what we had teed up earlier for discussion, was sort of where we were in the stakeholder workshops and sort of how we had sort of some of our thinkings had progressed in terms of what the opportunities are to look at hurdle-free transmission in the EDAM marketplace, and some of the different models in terms of what we're going to do. So I think at least what we're going to discuss here a little bit is sort of those first two approaches. We'll discuss those a little more in terms of really kind of grounding ourselves on what those first two options look like, but then get into some of the details about sort of the alternative approaches from
largely of which sort of relied upon some type of uplift cost in order to make the transmission provider whole from lost transmission revenues in some of the different models. And so I was going to discuss some of them at sort of a high level, give sort of an overview of what those models look like. And then I was going to turn it over to, as well as some of the questions that we have sort of keyed up internally and be looking for your all's feedback on. And then I was going to turn it over to James as well to walk through some of the spreadsheets that we had posted, which were focused primarily on the approach 3A and 3B, and really kind of walk through sort of the examples. And those are really meant to be more to facilitate a discussion around what those options look like. I don't think that we're certainly not expecting those to be adopted, as is by any participants, but we're really thinking that this discussion, if nothing else, will allow you all to be able to look at those worksheets, change the assumptions, look at sort of what might be sort of wrong, or how we might sort of want to adapt to any one of those proposals based on sort of a further example. So I think that's sort of the purpose of some of the spreadsheets and discussions, to make sure that there's kind of a good grounding in terms of what the calculations would look like. So at least sort of kicking it off, I mean, I'll go through this fairly quickly. I recognize that we're sort of constrained for time, is that the two frameworks were really sort of the fundamental models that we're focused on in the working groups. The first one was sort of was a model that was going to apply a transmission hurdle rate as a part of the market optimization, and that in order for transfers to clear in the market, they would basically have to exceed the value of the hurdle rate in order to occur. And that we really sort of viewed this as, getting at that core purpose of allowing for particularly that unsold bucket 3 transmission by the transmission provider to have an opportunity to recover those costs sort of directly into that market via the hurdle rate. But as we discussed before as well, we recognize the fact that by including that hurdle rate in the market, it really might have a large impact on the potential efficiency benefits in the market by restricting a significant amount of trade directly in the optimization through that constraint of the hurdle rate. As well as I think that we're kind of comparing that a little bit to sort of the option 2, which we kind of discussed in the work group as well. We got into a little bit into details of this in terms of the reciprocity framework, and that there's a number of variations that were discussed in the working group process, from potential reciprocity between bucket 1 and bucket 3. There was also various options just within that bucket 3 concept in terms of how reciprocity could work. And that kind of at the core of the reciprocity was really kind of looking at similar to the EIM concept, where in effect it would allow all transmission to be turned over to the market, optimized by the market hurdle free, and that in effect all parties would sort of agree that by doing this we're all better off, and that would have sort of the efficiency gains. And so those are kind of the main two options that were really discussed. I mean, most of the discussion really was really assuming that hurdle rate would be applied, but we really wanted to sort of think about that more. So so the ISO, we certainly appreciate. We reached out to a number of parties. We did sort of a lot of work internal ourselves in terms of developing out some examples of how we could address the transmission rate recovery issues while getting hurdle-free transmission to the market. So yeah, so look, that really led us to sort of those three other alternatives in terms of how we could address that, particularly through sort of uplift cost applied to different parties. So I think first, and again, I'll sort of to reiterate that James will provide sort of more details on this. And so
There'll be sort of some examples that can really kind of help flesh out, and that we'll sort of wait and hold questions on each of these till the end. So just because I think hopefully some of the examples where we have data in a spreadsheet can help provide more clarity in terms of what we're trying to address here. So kind of at a high level in terms of the what we'll call option 3A, was really applying a volumetric uplift charge on a per transaction basis. And that sort of the mechanics in terms of how we would be doing this would be that kind of the first step would be each EDMBA would calculate or forecast their expected lost transmission revenues. And that was really kind of be the fundamental basis of determining what are those revenues required to create that after the fact uplift cost. In terms of that, the next step would be the ISO forecasting the volume of wheel-throughs transactions or some other determinant to calculate a volumetric charge that would be assessed. And then we'd allocate the revenues associated with the wheel-through volumes to each EDM entity to make whole lost transmission revenues. And the fact that we're using forecasted and not actuals, we recognize there could be some discrepancy between these two. And so part of our proposal was that we could have some type of over or under collection through a true-up mechanism that could be applied after the fact. It could be on an annual basis or could be sort of applied to the next year. So that's really the high level of sort of our 3A, and we'll get into some of the details in terms of the mechanics of how that works. Approach 3B is similar. It has some slight different nuances. Under 3B, kind of the step one would be similar in terms of each EDMBA's the transmission server provider function would need to calculate its transmission revenue requirement, with the intent of keeping it financially neutral over some predetermined market framework. From that revenue requirement, we would, on an ongoing basis, deduct sales made via the OAT. We'd be assuming that on an ongoing basis that those revenues, that originally calculated revenue could have deductions based on sales on an ongoing basis. And then that expected gap could be pooled and allocated. And that's sort of the two ways that we framed it is it could be allocated based on total exports or imports in the market, or it could be allocated across all load in the EDM footprint. And the idea is really this could be an end-of-the-year true-up that keeps the EDM entities whole financially from a transmission revenue perspective, while allowing the EDM market to be optimized hurdle-free in the market. Hurdle-free. I apologize. So finally, approach 3C, and this is an approach that is a little different than the first two, but kind of builds upon, has sort of some similar properties to option 2 with a reciprocity arrangement. And it's really would have the EDM entities sort of in coordination with the IOs and other participants identify the revenues as historically derived from transmission transactions that sourced or sank the footprint, and then have a process or identified sort of ahead of time how would we assign those lost revenues to users and beneficiaries to remain revenue neutral. We kind of recognize that there's a lot of details that need to be sorted out in terms of this proposal, and we'd likely need to update the beneficiaries of hurdle-free transmission over time. And ideally, this would not be based on a historical volumes, but it will not be based on solely on volumes in the EDM market, which could cause potentially distortionary effects on market dispatch in order to avoid future transmission charges. So some of the questions that we are thoroughly teeing up around these topics are there any additional variations to the 3 approaches that could be used or considered in order to basically both address the lost transmission revenue issues while simultaneously achieving sort of a more efficient dispatch through hurdle-free hurdle-free transmission. For almost each of these proposals, I think that's one of the fundamental questions is sort of, what types of lost transmission revenue should be eligible to be recovered through an uplift costs, and particularly if it's going to be charged on a transaction basis, is there a way to potentially minimize these costs in order to lessen some of the distortionary effects that might occur from people changing their bidding behavior in order to minimize the amount of uplift costs they might receive after the fact. The third loose question that we're really teeing up is sort of, should the lost transmission revenue be allocated across the EDAM footprint? Should be allocated all load, or and sort of what's the basis of that allocation? And really, I think this is really getting at is we recognize the fact that these participants that the transmission providers want to be made whole for lost transmission revenues. And so the question would be, if we allow some sort of uplift costs, is there a way to minimize the distortion? It could be the case that, or if these costs are fairly low, then a per unit charge to all load might have a minimal impact and be non-distortionary. But if we're not doing that, I think often the discussion will likely be who are the beneficiaries and how do we sort of identify them on an equitable and fair basis going forward. And then at least on the last bullet, and this is really kind of, I think, what I was alluding to before, I think that some of the key questions of these different uplift designs are, could the different uplift designs have a distortionary effect on how participants bid in the market that could undo some of the efficiency gains that we're trying to achieve by removing hurdle-free transmission from the market? And so if you look at kind of the core thing that we're trying to avoid is, if we include the hurdle-free transmission directly into the market, the market optimization, we'll take the bids and optimize it, and we'll restrict efficient trades from happening through that market optimization. We wouldn't want to have some sort of uplift process that would instead make participants want to bake in that future uplift cost into their bids in a manner that would have significant distortionary effects on the market. So that question is really getting at how might the design be created to minimize those associated inefficiencies in the market. So I'll stop there, and I think that I'm going to turn it to James in order to walk through some of the examples in more detail in terms of how we're imagining the calculations will be formulated. And again, I'd sort of re-emphasize that we'll look forward to your questions, look forward to the details of this, but I really think that what we're trying to get at is really a starting point for discussions. That we're really trying to say, here are 3 ways that we have imagined it could work in terms of allowing for appropriate cost sharing while minimizing that distortionary uplift costs. But if there's sort of other methods that you all have or concerns you have with specific proposals, we really are looking for that type of feedback, and that, both in our comments as well as, here as well. So maybe we can pull up for the sake the next slide. Is the next slide if we click on it? No. Okay. Yeah, James is going to share now the spreadsheet examples that we provided that you all can see online as well, and walk through some of those examples. James, do you have those ready to go?
Yes, I just hit share. Can you guys see them?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. They're there, but they're not here. They're just gonna give us a second, James. They're on a couple of slides, not all of them.
Okay.
Okay. Now they're everywhere. Okay.
Okay. So what I did was I focused on options 3A and 3B. had too many variables in order to try to come up with some examples. But I wanted to give you the option to play with the spreadsheet and look at possible variations of 3A and 3B, so you can have an opportunity to consider this in more depth. I will be reposting it. There was a small error somewhere in the translation on the summation of the load when it comes to month by month. But I've corrected on this spreadsheet, and I will repost this after the call. Well, after the meeting, I'm on the call. So what I've done is I've highlighted, everything that's highlighted in yellow is fields in which I want you to be able to play with and allow you to see what the ramifications are when you make these modifications. The first table is the wheeling revenue that you forecast that you're supposed to be collecting. So this is, basically your transmission revenue requirement. The second table is wheeling revenue you collected or you expect to collect, and therefore we will get down to table 3, which is what you expect not to collect. So after that, then there's a table called anticipated exports loss. Here you can put in the forecast of the exports that was a baseline for your lost revenue. And what I did from here, I'm going to move over just a little bit, is I calculated a BAA rate and a uniform rate. So this first sheet I'm going to look at is going to be the application of the BAA rate using the 3A concept. I have a sheet for using a uniform rate, and then 2 of them actually. And this will give you a chance to walk through some of the thoughts behind this option. The next table is just basically load. Then I have net import transfers and net export transfers. Now what you'll see here is that I have one cell in the net export transfer that I don't want you to modify. And what I've created is, this is our fail-safe cell, is the net import transfers need to equal the net export transfers. So as you modify the net import transfers, it will automatically make adjustments to this unhighlighted cell. So as long as you're modifying the highlighted cells, I will make sure that in this particular case, 1.32 million megawatts over the year of net import transfers is equal to the 1,321,000 megawatt hours of net export transfers. Now, these 3 elements will become key features in the 3A assessment, because the first thing I'm going to do is, the first option is use straight wheeling exports or wheeling transfers to calculate the amount of loss wheeling charges that you actually could collect. And so what we did is, for this one, I take the minimum of my net import versus net export. So obviously, if my net import exceeds my net export, that means some of this net import transfer is going to serve load. So I'm trying to identify the amount of megawatts which are actually wheeling through your balancing authority area. Now, again, I've done this on a monthly basis, and you'll see a lot of the numbers are exactly the same because of my proration. But once we get into discussion on the details of it, we can get into how we should do this on a daily basis, on a monthly basis. This is just to give you a little high-level review. So once I'm able to calculate what the wheeling export megawatts are, then I calculated what the total wheeling amount is. So each of these quantities I multiplied by the BAA rate, and I came up with a total. Now, I could have done it as a full table, but instead I created in this one cell, basically this megawatt times this price, and I identified how much loss wheeling or how much wheeling rates or fees you should collect in a given month for energy wheeling through your BAA or all the BAAs. So in this case, I have $11 million, which based upon my net imports and export transfers, I should have collected in order to recovery for your lost wheeling revenue. Now, the question is, and this is just giving you a baseline of we think you should be able to collect, so who do you collect it from and who should be paid for that wheeling amount? Now, the first option is that we look at the net imports. And if you are a net importer, your load of that BAA would pick up a portion of this revenue that should be collected. So what I did is I took the load ratio share of that BAA over the BAA total, and I took in that month's wheeling revenues and said, okay, in this case, BAA1, that load should pay $656,000 of the $966,000 that should be collected during the EDAM market. And then so it's being pro-ratably allocated to the load within those BAAs. And then the PTOs within the other BAAs, and where this is coming from is those PTOs or BAAs that told us what the lost revenues are. Those are the PTOs that I'm referring to. And so we will take this $11 million and we will allocate it based upon their lost transmission revenue requirements. So now I'm basically charging load that is a net importer and paying the PTOs that have lost the revenue. The last option or second option is instead of using the net import, you use basic load ratio share. And so the PTO's payment doesn't change, but the load ratio share actually gets adjusted a little bit. And because it's not based upon net importing, it's based upon the overall load ratio share of the BAA to the entire BAA. Now, again, this first one is based on a BAA rate. Now, the second one, the second tab here, is I did it based upon a uniform rate. And in this case, the uniform rate was $7.44. And so what I did is I used that $7.44 to calculate the lost revenue or the amount you should be collecting for the energy that is wheeling through. So again, the tables aren't changing. I try to keep it all pretty straightforward and simple. And so we have a significantly different, because I used a blended rate, we went from $11 million down to $7 million of collection. And now that $7 million collection is, just to make it a little simple, I just show the calculation to the net importers, but we can carry over if we need to the load ratio share. I just wanted to make things simple from this point forward. The third sheet for 3A is a little bit different. Instead of looking at just wheeling through, I actually decided to introduce the idea of wheeling out as well. So all of the revenue that is going to be collected is based upon your total net export transfers. This then accounts for energy that is wheeled through your BAA, but also any generation that is being wheeled out to serve another BAA. Now, this gives us a number that is obviously in between the two. It gives us $9.8 million. Now, with the allocation methodology for this sheet as well, I just used the net importers, and then the wheeling was paid to the PTOs based upon their transmission revenue requirements. So these first three sheets will give you an idea of how we potentially can apply the 3A option. We can do it by the BAA rate. We can do it by a uniform rate. Now, I could have done a BA rate by using the total exports. I just decided that these three options were all you needed to work with for now. But the other option is, again, we need to discuss whether or not it's going to be a wheel through or if it should be on a total wheeling transfers out of a BAA. And so that includes any energy that's being transferred out from internal generation to serve another load. The last two, go ahead.
James, I was going to jump in before you went to sort of the tabs for 3B, and just sort of make sure that we're grounded on sort of what you're walking through and the purpose of it. Again, I recognize that these are complicated calculations. We certainly wanted to let you all have the tools and to have James walk you through them. But I think what James has really done is sort of created a tool that would allow participants to see different ways in which we could calculate the revenue requirements, different ways that we could allocate the costs of those revenues to different participants associated with them, associated with those volumes. And so, so I think that at least the details I think here are really critical to understand those, but at least I thought I'd want to reframe them in terms of that's really kind of the fundamental purpose of this, is trying to figure out, is creating basically a variety of different options in terms of calculating the revenues, calculating that volumetric uplift charge, and determining sort of what those appropriate parties are to assign those costs to. So, James, please proceed. I recognize we have some questions maybe.
This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I admit I'm not following this perfectly or really at all. And I'm sorry, it's been a really long day. And I'm wondering if perhaps we could review these and then contact someone at the CAISO with questions. If you could tell me who that is, that would be great.
You could absolutely do it. You can contact myself and or James. We certainly will be happy to sort of walk through them with parties.
Feel free to contact me, Carrie. I can give you a quick example of how this thing works on 3A. So if I change the BAA 3's transmission revenue requirements to 61, I don't know if they let me do it.
Yeah, Jim, this is Milos. Let me just jump in. I think this is going to be a topic for one of the workshops that I was mentioning earlier. At the end of June as well. We have posted this spreadsheet for stakeholders to review and take a look over, and possibly I would encourage you, if you take a look, reach out to us. We've tried to put together one of the tabs, kind of an explanation of how the spreadsheet is intended to work and to be used. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is illustrate the three examples for creating an uplift charge after the fact for transmission in order to ensure transmission revenue recovery for the EDAM entity.
Right. I was going to say there's all sorts of creative ways to do an option 3 approach, as you can see. I guess we do need some feedback about whether we should pursue an option 3 non-hurdle rate approach or go back to something else, hurdle rate for the bucket 3. I think that's kind of a foundational question that we needed answered. The details of which option we end up going with, I think, needs to be further developed through the workshops.
All right. So with that, I think we're going to hold for questions. let everybody sort of absorb the material, and then we'll come back and revisit this with open questions. We probably have some time tomorrow in our open slot for questions. And then, of course, following up, as Mark said, through workshops. Okay, so thanks, ISO team. We're going to do a quick set change. Wanted to make sure we could hear our next stakeholder panel. So we wanted to allocate enough time for that. So if I could have Doug bring up his panel, please. So I am very pleased to introduce Doug Boccione. And I took Italian lessons so I could say that. If there was anything I was going to get right today, it was that name. So I'm very pleased that Doug is moderating today's panel on the transmission commitment. Doug is a principal with Flynn Resource Consultants, Inc., primarily representing the municipal utilities within the CAISO BAA. He is a WEIM Regional Issues Forum consumer-owned utility sector liaison and has been involved in Western electric markets since the 1980s. So he has assembled a great panel. I think two of his panelists are going to be virtual only, which is Meg McNall and Kathy Anderson. Just want to confirm that we have you virtually. Can I get a confirmation from Meg and Kathy?
Hi, yeah, this is Kathy. I'm here.
And hi there, this is Meg McNall. I should be here as well.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. All right, Doug, it's all yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joanne. So I'm going to start. I'll just do a quick introductions of the panelists who are in the room and also online, and then we'll roll into some discussion of what I thought were some of the key topics related to transmission. I'll start by introducing Russ Manteville, who's the Director of Market Initiatives at Bonneville Power Administration. He's been the project manager for the regional entities using BPA's transmission to join the EIM and help negotiate and implement the coordinated transmission agreement between BPA and CAISO. He was the policy lead for BPA's EIM decision and managed BPA's slice contract. To his left is Jeff Spires, who was already introduced on the last panel, so I won't repeat his background, but I will say that he has represented PowerX on a variety of CAISO stakeholder initiatives very ably and always brings good ideas to the discussion. I'm going to go online to Kathy Anderson, who's the Senior Manager of Real-Time Operations and Markets at Idaho Power. She manages the team responsible for the real-time operation of Idaho Power's bulk electric transmission system, generation dispatch, balancing area and load service obligations, including EIM operations. And she oversees the administration of Idaho Power's FERC open access transmission tariff and the generator interconnection queue process, and is also involved in regional market development and policy efforts. Also online, we have Meg McNall, who's a partner at Thompson Coburn. She currently chairs the firm's energy practice. She primarily practices before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and has represented the 6 cities for more than 18 years, working on issues such as energy market policy and design and on transmission access and rates. And the 6 cities are municipal utilities located within the CAISO balancing authority area who are also participating transmission owners. And then finally, we have Kevin Smith, who's an attorney with Braun Blazing Smith & Wynn and represents Balancing Authority of Northern California. He counsels public agency clients on matters related to open access transmission tariff administration, NERC-WEC reliability standards compliance, resource planning and contracts, transmission development and reserve sharing, and is actively engaged in efforts related to CAISO markets and the Western Energy Imbalance Market and the extended day-ahead market. So you can see we've got a kind of a diverse panel, different backgrounds. We've got some attorneys, some more technical folks, and people from most of the region. We are missing the desert Southwest entities, but we know they're in the audience. Hopefully we can get a little bit of audience participation. I want to start by asking Kevin Smith if he could help explain the formula in D32 on James's spreadsheet. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. So, Kevin, you were involved in the group of EIM entities who got together and talked about, extending to the day-ahead market, and you came up with that group came up with this sort of 3-bucket concept. And I thought that it would be helpful to just start this discussion if you could sort of give some background on why you came up with that concept, what the core principles were, and maybe how your thinking has evolved over time.
Okay, thanks. So if Mark's lesson 4 was don't put George before lunch. Lesson 5 is don't put transmission before drinking. So this is a bad place to be right now. Everybody's thinking about, I want to drink a beer right now. I don't want to listen to this crap. So anyway, all right. So how do we get there? As we worked as an EIM entity group, we were trying to put some structure around how transmission is going to be viewed, how it's utilized, and so forth. And so the buckets just became a simple convention, I think, and Jeff was involved with this as well, and Kathy for sure. And so it wasn't to create a dogma around, some design concept. It was really just a way of how we would talk about transmission. Bucket 1 being, resource sufficiency, transmission, bucket 2 being, for the most part, third-party sales of transmission, OAT sales, ETCs, transmission that really wasn't under the purview necessarily of the transmission service provider. And then bucket 3 being what was left, ATC, what gets marketed, put on Oasis. And we were trying to find a way how to categorize these things. I think in answering Doug's question is how did this change? I think when we went into the discussion, from my perspective, I think maybe Jeff or others might agree. I thought bucket 2 was the issue. I didn't think bucket 3 was an issue. It was just what's left, what's up on Oasis at 10 a.m. or 9 a.m. And, you port it over to the CAISO and you put a hurdle rate on it and it either gets optimized or not. So I thought that was pretty straightforward and simple. Bucket 2, which hopefully we'll talk a little bit about as well, was this issue of how do we use transmission that's already been sold under oaths? How do you protect those rights and so forth? What ended up becoming, I'll call it like the aha moment, was bucket 3. And bucket 3, we as EIM entities didn't necessarily look at it from both sides of the ledger. We looked at it as how do we recover our costs? How do we put some, how do we get that into the market, make it available? We have to follow FERC precedent. There's all kinds of issues that come into that. But what ended up happening is as we looked at this and started talking hurdle rates, well, you have the elephant in the room, CAISO, right? A little bit of a significant hurdle rate there. And from our perspective, the idea is maximizing transmission availability. And so from my evolution is, I think bucket 2 is abundantly resolvable. And I would also say that when we started our conversation, bucket 1 was assumed to be so much of the transmission that bucket 3 was just an increment. We would be able to flow the lifeblood of EDAM. EIM is flexibility, right? Moving up, moving down, being able to take in transfers, optimization. We thought that bucket 1 would give us, and I think Mark would agree to this as well, we thought that was most of it. And it turned out it's not, because it didn't contain enough BA to BA transfer capacity. So then bucket 3 became the focus. So I'll kind of stop there, is that bucket 3 was the aha. We have to solve that. I would personally like to put a dagger in the heart forever of the hurdle rate concept, but that's just my own personal view.
Thanks, Kevin. You think we should transition to a discussion a little bit of the hurdle rate and tie it back to the previous. Kathy, can you comment on, do you agree with the premise that it would be better for economic efficiency that there isn't a hurdle rate? And then if so, is it important to keep the transmission providers whole for the lost revenues that they used to rely upon?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the opportunity. Sorry I can't be there in person. I also had a COVID exposure in my household that changed my entire travel. So, yeah, at the beginning when we were thinking the hurdle rate, as Kevin mentioned, we really were not, we knew it was going to hinder the market some. We were thinking, it's probably not significant, but as the discussions continued and progressed, it became apparent that, the more hurdle rates you stick in the market solution, the less economic and effective and optimized your solution becomes. And especially when you start thinking exports from California, then exports from Nevada, then, to Idaho, that starts to become a significant dollar hurdle that has to be overcome just to start moving between these VAs. And this pancake rate that we do see today in the bilateral world, I do recognize that, but it will greatly affect the market efficiencies that we're all trying to get. So then we started thinking about the ultimate goal is to get as much transmission connectivity between each other as we can into this market, because as we've seen in EIM, the greater the transmission availability between two BAs is, the greater the transfers that can occur and the greater your benefit opportunities are. So the thinking started to move away from that, but that revenue is still very important to transmission providers, especially those transmission providers that have significant third-party transmission revenues that they receive. And so the concept is it can't be free, because those transmission service providers, of which Idaho Power, quite honestly, is one of them, just simply because of where we sit, that lost revenue would be very difficult to overcome from a benefits perspective to our customers. And so that kind of led to that concept of, well, how do we maybe not put a hurdle rate in there, but still take a look at what is that at-risk revenue that could be recovered in some fashion from the market? Because reciprocity doesn't really work in the day ahead, because you're talking a much bigger pool of potential lost revenue than you are in the EIM. EIM, again, is that kind of concept of leftover, unused, unscheduled transmission in the hour, or very close to the hour, as opposed to a big block of potentially firm transmission in the day ahead market that could be uncompensated for.
Thanks, Kathy. So, Russ, do you agree with the concept that the transmission provider needs some mechanism to get compensated for the lost revenues? And I'll put a little twist on it. Should you or must you consider the transfer revenue credits against those lost revenues from a FERC accounting standpoint?
So to one, yes. And I think that it's important, I think, to keep in mind, this is especially the case for BPA, is that we're talking about meeting a revenue requirement, cost recovery, essentially, right? And so I think it's careful to keep in mind that I don't think we're talking about incremental revenue for transmission providers. Bonneville in particular, we just recovered our costs. I think that's typically true for everybody. I know we're just a normal, benevolent, nonprofit corporation. But in terms of whether you should credit the congestion revenue, I think that is, there's no simple answer to that question, and there are I think a lot of gremlins in terms of congestion revenue allocation that exists today that Bonneville has experienced even prior to joining the EIM, given that there have been transmission constraints that have been enforced in our system since 2014, right? So we've been causing, having congestion modeled in the market for a while, but it's been kind of allocated everywhere. So I think that taking them into account makes sense. I think what you would want is whether, so when we talk about the hurdle rate or an uplift, you're talking kind of about the billing determinant and the mechanism for collecting it. Ultimately, in that respect, in terms of the cost recovery and the extent to which congestion revenue might offset some of the lost revenue, I think you want a rate making mechanism that is responsive to how it's working, whether it's an uplift or whether it's a hurdle rate. I think that, this is pretty prospective, what we're talking about here in terms of what the lost revenue might be for an individual transmission provider or a group of transmission providers. So I think ultimately what you want is, everybody here loves rate cases. I think you're signing up for a bunch more rate cases, right? Because the notion that you're going to get it 100% correct the first time is illusory, right? And so I think that, whether or the extent to which you would credit things like that for a transmission provider, I think you need a process that's able to effectively evaluate how much of a credit or how you should make adjustments moving forward, and whether that's recovered through a hurdle rate or an uplift. Both of those have benefits and drawbacks, but I think those principles are maybe more important.
So Jeff, if there was no hurdle rate for bucket 3 transfers, do you foresee any unintended consequences that would be detrimental?
Well, first off, I would agree with what everyone's sort of identified, that I think is pretty clear, that all else being equal, avoiding hurdle rates is the ideal to get a more efficient dispatch. I think that the challenge fundamentally, though, is to really try to keep the bucket of costs that Russ was referring to small enough that there is a reasonable mechanism, and the CAISO staff's put forward a few different ways to do that. But if the bucket of money is small, there are probably multiple ways to recover that. But the risk is that you end up with a significant bucket of dollars that you're trying to recover through a fee or through something else that either sort of reintroduces a hurdle rate indirectly, or just creates risks of cost shifts between participants that they can't, that they're not comfortable with. And so I think that one of the risks, or one of the areas that's really important to emphasize, is recognizing that the OAT framework will continue to exist. Bilateral transactions will continue to exist. We have many different TSPs, many different customers. Some of those TSPs really rely heavily on third-party revenue. Customers have various uses of their rights. They want to ensure that they can have priority based on their OAT rights and get the economic value. Finding a way to make sure that those benefits and that framework is upheld through the market is critical, because then what you do is you maintain the incentive to invest in the transmission system on a long-term basis through the OAT. You keep the bucket of dollars small, and then you have options on how to work through an appropriate way to recover that small amount of money.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to go to Meg in a minute, but I saw Kevin taking some notes, so it looked like you might have wanted to respond to something that either Russ or Jeff said.
Well, I just to respond directly to one question is, from my perspective, and it ties back to what Jeff just said, is I do think it should be small, because what you're talking about is, as Jeff noted, existing OAT sales are going to continue. And so, there should be a significant pool of that revenue requirements going to get collected. And I think these transfer revenues are a source, and they should be included in that. So I don't think that this is a huge nut to crack. I don't think so, but I am not an economist and I'm not an engineer, but it just intuitively should be a relatively small number. And I think it has to be. And then it just gets into the validation of how you calculate that lost revenue, which we can talk about.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Meg. You're a FERC attorney. Do you have to count those transfer revenues as credits? Do you have a choice?
Well, first of all, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So in terms of whether FERC policy would dictate whether those transfer revenues need to be counted against this, I think there are certainly strong arguments to be made that these should be included in what is considered a lost revenue. I guess as a more general matter, and backing up a little bit to some of the comments that my fellow panelists have already provided, I generally agree that we should be working toward the goal of minimizing or eliminating hurdle rates, and it would enhance the economic efficiency of these transactions. I guess one objective that I have in this conversation, and that I think we need to be looking at from a CAISO participating transmission owner and LSE perspective, is ensuring that if we're going to look at mechanisms to minimize or reduce hurdle rates and methodologies for compensating for lost revenues, we need to ensure that the CAISO transmission system is equally included in those methodologies. This can't be a structure that we're putting in place to ensure that external EDAM participants are made whole, and the CAISO is not. So we are very interested in ensuring equal treatment.
Thanks, Meg. So I want to shift a little bit to talk. This came up in a couple of the sessions this morning. What should be done with the unscheduled transmission? So this would be transmission that would, point-to-point transmission that would otherwise qualify as bucket 2, but for whatever reason wasn't released, but the transmission customer did not actually schedule on it. Should that transmission be optimized in the EDAM or not? And, what should be done with the revenues from that optimization? And start with Kathy.
I was going to have you start with Jeff because he's a transmission customer. I think that
he gets the last word.
Okay. Again, if you go back to, the thought that more transmission in the market is better, then it would lead you to want to take unscheduled transmission in there. The trick with that is the transmission customer, especially that firm right holder, has the right to use that transmission even through the day ahead period into real time. That is their right under the OAT. So unless you go change all of that, in your OAT, that's still their inherent right. So if the market utilizes that, and the customer then wants to also utilize that, what happens with if that creates congestion? Who pays for that? And that also potentially becomes a source of lost revenue for a transmission service provider, because if the transmission customer does not schedule their firm rights, then the transmission service provider can sell that non-firm also and create some revenue to go against their revenue requirements. So, the part of me that wants to optimize the entire system and get the most benefits says yes, take them. But I think that there's just some legalities around that to ensure that, number one, they can continue to use their rights, and number two, we deal with who pays for that congestion that could occur when they go to use those rights later on.
All right, I'm going to go to Russ because I think he might have some of the answers to these issues.
I don't, but it's not going to stop me from talking. So I agree with Kathy. For anybody doing this, you would have to change your oath. So whatever we surmise is the answer here would ultimately be reviewed by FERC. And everybody has different regulatory regimes. For IRUs, they would have to file it for BPA. We have our own tariff process, et cetera. Generally, also, I agree with having more transmission available to optimize for the market. I think that the congestion revenue, where that goes to, I don't know. It's tough, right? If somebody schedules if they make it available, I guess in this situation, we're talking about making it available as a BA to BA transfer. Whereas if they were to schedule it, they would probably not be scheduling it as a transfer that would be available to BAs. And I think that you start to get into some of the limitations that exist in the market today in terms of focusing on BA to BA transfers and the assumption that they represent transmission paths and transmission elements. And so I think that it's tough to say where the congestion revenue ought to be allocated. But I think also for all of these, relying on congestion revenue is kind of self-defeating, which is why we haven't seen a lot of people donate EIM transmission unless they have load, because by donating transmission, you're less likely to receive the congestion revenue, right? Like you're decreasing the likelihood of congestion. So in any case, anybody relying on transmission revenue as a mechanism is only going to work if there is congestion, which creates awkward incentives. So I took no positions and I provided no answers. Then I'm done.
Perfect. You did your job. So Kevin, go ahead.
I'll take a position. I'm strongly support the idea of releasing bucket 2. And the lifeblood of this system and the market efficiencies created, I think are going to speak for themselves. Flexibility is king in EIM right now. That's what we've learned. So the more that's out there. However, I recognize my friend to my right will have very strong views about, and I myself, believe in preserving those open access rights. The only addendum I'd put on what Kathy said, which I agree with 100%, is that the FERC pro forma tariff recognizes the right to schedule up to 10 a.m. and most of our OATs have that in them, after which it's accommodated to the extent practicable. So what that says is that there is not an infinite right to schedule, not infinite, but all the way up through real time. It has to be accommodated by the TSP if they can do so. In our case, what we're talking about is redispatch. We will accommodate. There's a cost to that. Then it just becomes a cost allocation and how we deal with that. So I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but to me, the efficiency of releasing transmission outweighs the potential maybe risk of redispatch and other costs, because I do think we should honor those OAT rights. And then the other distinction is just to put a marker on the ETC rights, which we have entities like WAPA and other PMAs, but they have long-term contracts, that those may have to be looked at very differently because those are not subject to, open access. They are pre-OAT arrangements and they need to probably be preserved through self-schedules or some other mechanism. But phantom congestion, all these other things, we don't need that. Let's free up the grid and, see what we can get. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. I said I'd give Jeff the last word on this subject. So I just want to put a little twist on it, because I think in the previous session, I think what I heard you describe, your concern about, parties bidding in at the intertie and then, going out and finding transmission sort of after the fact. To me, that sounds like a lot like they were using the unscheduled transmission and they procured non-firm rights to do that. And so I'm just wondering, is that much different from what would happen if the EDAM used the transmission? And sort of the follow-up question is, wouldn't you then just be motivated to release the transmission that you didn't schedule, because then you'd get the revenues that way?
I think the challenge with that is, in that scenario, what you're in effect allowing for is the non-firm user, which I think is a reasonable way to articulate that, the non-firm user to step in front of the firm rights holder. So then the challenge that Kathy described and Kevin elaborated on as well is that you end up in a situation that when the firm rights holder attempts to use their rights, there's really two fundamental issues. One is that puts the original EDAM solution in a situation in which it's no longer feasible. That could create a reliability challenge. Or even if it doesn't, I think as everyone's recognized, it creates congestion and redispatch costs that someone has to bear. And so as a firm rights holder that invests in those rights to gain priority access on those paths, to get the economic value, and to be able to physically schedule and have the priority of those rights, if some of that value is withdrawn because now there's new congestion payments that are necessary when you go to use your rights, as an example, that is a disincentive to continue to invest in the system rather than just bid into EDAM and allow EDAM to and flow on the non-firm transmission that comes up through EDAM. So maybe if I back it up, I think the challenge here in my mind is where we're starting from when we are thinking about what EDAM represents. And my understanding of what most people, or at least some of us, have contemplated EDAM as representing is a voluntary market, coexists with the OAT, coexists with the bilateral framework. We have to have a mechanism to protect those firm transmission rights that entities are investing in. That's beneficial for the TSPs and ties into the earlier discussion around trying to make sure that there's still a framework to recover costs and that we're not, at risk of significant cost shifts resulting from entities choosing not to invest in those rights any longer.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to change gears a little bit. I want to talk about the transfer revenue allocation. I think, there's three options that were discussed in the working groups that we heard this morning. I think James walked through some examples that were really describing the CAISO's preferred approach, which I think they're now calling option 2, which is to, for most transfers between non-ISO EDAM participants, would there be a 50-50 sharing of the transfer revenues? But for what they call the Wheel 2 type transactions, which I think only would exist with the CAISO, the non-CAISO BA would get 100% of the transfer revenues, and the CAISO would keep the congestion revenues. So I want to ask a question to Meg. What's your reaction to that approach as opposed to the alternatives, which would be to, treat the CAISO the same as the other BAAs, or the option 3, which is don't just look at transfer revenues, also consider congestion in the sharing?
Yeah. So thank you. I think I'm now thoroughly confused about which option has which number. So I'll talk a little more generally first. From the Six Cities perspective, I think we are working from the premise that the CAISO should share in transfer revenues on a comparable basis to other EDAM BAAs. This approach whereby we are setting up a structure that may be EIM-like, that would effectively result in a full allocation of those transfer revenues to external parties is not something that we think is appropriate in the context of an extended day-ahead market. And I guess drilling down into some of the different distinctions that the ISO is making. I think the ISO is supporting option 1. At least that was my read of the paper, but I may have that wrong. And if I do, please tell me. But this distinction about transmission through versus to in intertie point with another EDM BAA, to me seems like a distinction that is not very meaningful for purposes of transfer revenue allocation. And so we have concerns about that. I also think we need to spend a lot more time on this issue in the stakeholder process, and noting that there are workshops scheduled for later this summer. I'll just observe that within the working group, the specific topic of how the CAISO's transmission system will be made available within the EDM market, and how transfer revenue allocations will be available or not available to the CAISO, was something that I think unfortunately was not discussed as extensively as I would like to see discussed in the remainder of the stakeholder process. We were very pressed for time in working group 2, and so I just think there needs to be a more complete review of that. And so I guess all of that having been said, at this point, the cities haven't developed a firm position on the different options that the CAISO has proposed, but we are most supportive at this point of option 2 as being most closely aligned with the principle that the CAISO participating transmission owners and CAISO load should not be disadvantaged when it comes to that transfer revenue allocation.
Thanks, Meg. Russ, any reactions? You fully understand the difference between wheel to and wheel through, and do you have a preference for the allocation methodologies? Which one should be adopted?
I have some probably distracting hot takes instead. So in terms of the wheel through and wheel to, I think that for the purposes of true congestion that occurs at an intertie, both seem reasonable. I think typically you do the 50-50 here, and I don't have a strong position on that. I think that there's a more fundamental concern that exists in the EIM now that I think should be discussed in terms of building upon that in the EDAM, which is going to be a much larger market, which is that for much of the footprint, if you were to assume that the EDAM footprint matched the EIM footprint, congestion is not truly going to occur at those points of interchange. There are a few significant points of interchange that really reflect transmission elements on which there's going to be congestion. Whereas for BPA, we have 18 adjacencies, and there's not 18, clearly delineated, geographic areas and electrical systems that we're connected to. And so I think that fundamentally there is a significant risk of congestion revenue being created that is totally unmoored to a point of interchange as modeled as in terms of a BA to BA transfer. So I think that and this happens now, and it's typically thought of as being quote unquote inside a balancing authority, but that balancing authority is not a transmission provider, and this is a point where conflating those things runs into some issues. So on the one hand, congestion can occur, but that could limit one BA's ability to deliver load to itself. But there would be no congestion that's represented on a transfer because the congestion would show up in Bonneville's case on a flow gate. And the inverse is equally true, where you could see congestion on a BA to BA transfer because somebody has to submit an incremental tag to provide that transfer. And so you can end up congested when there's no physical congestion on the system whatsoever and avoid an optimization. So I think that, and so in both of those cases, not only are you going to have an unclear picture of congestion, which I think is going to lead to de-optimization. I think also it's incredibly difficult to find out to whom the revenue should go. So I think that a further discussion about how congestion revenue is created is important in order to answer that question. Because once again, I think you have to pick some heuristics in this, especially when you're sort of backing your way into an organized market and you don't have a single balancing authority, you don't have a single transmission service provider and operator. But I think at some point in time, those heuristics might cause more problems than they're worth. And so I think having, from Bonneville's perspective, certainly in our region, we'd like to have a further discussion about where congestion occurs, where it truly occurs. Make sure you're limiting congestion to where it really occurs, and also figuring out really where the congestion revenue is created, and I think that's important before you start to discuss, which party is going to have to allocate it. Otherwise, from Bonneville's perspective, that just pushes the question to us as a transmission service provider, because I think more than 50% of our revenue comes from not our load, right? And we wheel more than our load at all points in time. We have pseudo ties and dynamics in excess of our load almost in all points in time. So it pushes this question to the transmission provider about who then are we going to sub-allocate that to. So I think from our perspective, we'd really like to have a better conversation about better understanding where congestion occurs and how the revenue is created.
Thanks, Russ. I want to allow some time for comments or questions from the audience, but I do want to get Jeff Spires your thoughts on the allocation and also give you an opportunity to comment on, as an existing rights holder, if your rights are in an EDAM BAA, what are your thoughts about the self-scheduling of those rights? Is that going to be sufficient to sort of maintain your, physical scheduling priority that you enjoy today?
Thanks, Doug. I think this congestion allocation question, I'm going to try to back it up a little bit and just describe my interpretation and understanding of the issue at a high level, setting aside transfer revenue, setting aside congestion, and how you allocate that. When you have two BAs that connect together, the proposal is, to the extent that there is value of those transmission lines that occurs through congestion, that gets split 50-50. And basically that's in recognition of the two BAs are coming together and they're connecting to one another. You've got rights that are necessary to get the energy out of the first BA. You have rights holders that are bringing transmission to get the energy into the purchasing BA. And so that it's logical to say, to the extent that there's value of those lines and that there's transfers created, that should be allocated 50-50 between the two BAs. And that's what the EDAM proposal is, except for transactions with the CAISO at the interties. In that case, the proposal or the preferred approach is for the software to calculate which side was deemed to have filled first, and whichever side that is the side that receives 100% of the value. And really this comes down to the key issue here is the Pacific AC and the Pacific DC. Those lines are about 8,000 megawatts combined that support significant volumes of interregional trade between the Northwest and California. And they were jointly built, jointly funded by entities both in California and in the Northwest to the benefit of both regions. The challenge here is that these lines are in effect split horizontally. So you have different TSPs like BPA and different customers that have rights on the northern segment, and then you have the CAISO that operates the southern segment with their rights holders. And so, for example, the Pacific DC is the most simple example to illustrate this. It's a single line that goes from Oregon to Southern California. It's a DC line. There's one transfer path. But there are multiple owners. On the northern segment, there are BPA rights holders that own contractual rights from Big Eddy, the northern segment, to Knob, which is halfway down that DC line. And then the CAISO has its share that's from Knob to the southern end at Sylmar. And so you have two different groups of entities that are coming together to fund and contribute to a single line in that case, supporting interregional trade. So they're major lines, 8,000 megawatts, hundreds of millions of dollars of value, multiple entities funding those lines. In every other situation, between every other BA, the proposal is 50-50, recognizing that, except for this. And in this case, it will follow the software to determine which side fills first, and then depending on the outcome of that, the allocation will end up being 100% to the entities on the side of that line that was deemed to fill first. And so this really is an extension of existing SEAMS issue. It is something that's gone on for a long time, decades of debates about how the value is allocated. And the other market rules that contributed to this have an impact. And so in terms of whether or not there are E-tags, whether or not entities can submit bids halfway up the DC line at Knob to create the impression that there's more capability to deliver into the CAISO BA at Knob, even though there aren't enough rights on the external system to actually deliver to that location. These are really significant challenges that lead to that proposal, in our view, not being workable at all. It makes much more sense to just say, these are jointly funded lines, they create value. When that value is realized through the market, they should be split equitably between the northern segment and California in the way that was originally intended. And that's our perspective on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So do we have time to do some questions?
Yes, we can take a few questions, although that might be dangerous because, yeah, go ahead, Mark. Oh, the batteries.
So, I know we haven't been explicit about this, but I think, Jeff, I agree with you, and I think the DC is a mixed case. And I think it's different from the Coy case. And we can talk about that maybe offline about how they differentiated. But I think your point about they meet in the middle and there's rights holders on each side, and it doesn't go fully to the scheduling point. Sylmar is a different scenario. And I think we would say that the DC itself is a 50-50 sharing scenario. We haven't been explicit about it, but I just wanted to be clear about that's a mixed case. The Coy, I think, is a different case because you go to the scheduling point. Malin is the scheduling point. The ITC south of Malin is within our area, south of the scheduling point, and I think that's different. I think we can continue to talk about that, but that I just wanted to be clear about the DC versus the AC.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And I do think more dialogue certainly is welcome, and I appreciate you clarifying that. I mean, these are obviously complicated issues we won't solve today, but I wanted to at least provide a high-level perspective on what we think is the right path forward.
All right. Do you want to take a couple questions?
Yeah, I'd like to. And in particular, if there's anyone from the Desert Southwest who wants to weigh in, raise your hand. If you don't, no problem. I know George wants to weigh in.
So it looks like George has
he wants to stand between cocktails.
No, really quick. It's a clarification question for Jeff. You mentioned something that the software will determine which piece of the intertie fills first. I wasn't sure. That's something I heard, and I want to understand what you meant, because we get the solution simultaneously calculated. We get it in one shot. We don't have pieces coming in.
Thanks, George. I think all I was trying to say was, as opposed to in the other cases, there's an upfront agreement that I can describe right here, 50-50. What the other proposal would lead to is you don't know which side gets the value. It depends on what the software calculates in terms of, is it the south side that fills first? Is it the north side? That's not predictable. That's where, in our view, the risk is that it's systemically to one. It results in congestion occurring systemically on one side of the intertie rather than having a predictable and well-defined sharing mechanism in advance.
But that's the part that I didn't understand. If you said the south part or the north part fills first, we just have one solution that says how much flows on the DC.
No, you don't, because you accept intertie bids at knob. So you can have a calculation that says the second half of the DC line is full.
But we get the solution in one shot, both with the intertie bids and the transfers.
Yeah, I think the intertie bids are competing with the transfers, but I'm not sure that that's the important distinction, though, because I mean the reality is that Malin and Captain Jack, they're no different than other interties between the other EDAM BAAs. I mean the DC is a unique case, but I actually don't really see the difference. You've got parties built transmission to a scheduling point at their boundary, and no transfers would take place, whether there were intertie bids or EDAM transfers, unless you had all of that transmission, on both sides. And I think that's the part that makes people uncomfortable.
All right, we do have a question online. So, Christina?
Yep. Shreyas, can you open the phone line, please?
Sure. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hey. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, hey, this is Rohan Chatterjee from Pacific Corp, and I apologize for coming in the way of your cocktails. So sorry about that. But I did want to follow up regarding that bucket 2 transmission, where there's been a lot of good conversation about those unscheduled transmission rights being donated to the market at the beginning of the 10 a.m. time frame, and then being made available to the transmission customers at 1 p.m. And, just hoping to hear the ISO's thoughts on, or even anybody else on the panel, your thoughts on, if all transmission customers are going to have those transmission rights be made available to them at 1 p.m. and beyond, with the likelihood that they may choose to reuse it, and if they did, then that would obviously, potentially have the market re-optimize and, cause congestion. So I'm just hoping to get the panel's on, what could be done to sort of prevent, transmission customers from reusing those transmission rights after the 1 p.m. time frame, and such that, there's not a significant amount of re-optimization needed by the market in real time. And sort of the foundation that I would lay this question on is the fact that bucket 2, the voluntary transmission donation, once that is donated by the transmission customer, it is locked in and continues to stay locked in through the VINE. So it's submitted, it's locked in, and it stays that way through the EIM timeframe. Whereas in this unscheduled paradigm, it's donated, available for market optimization from 10 to 1, but at 1 p.m., it is available again to the transmission customers for reuse, and then, potentially leading to congestion and market re-optimization. So kind of curious to hear the ISO and the panel's thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is Doug. I think I want to direct this to one of the transmission providers. I'm wondering, Kathy, if you have a response. I mean, if that unscheduled transmission was used by the EDAM, would it then not be available? You wouldn't re-release it at 1. It would only be available to the existing rights holder who had purchased it and not scheduled on it, right? You're not going to resell something that was already optimized, right?
Correct. Yeah. If the market is optimized unscheduled transmission, it wouldn't be released as non-firm to other customers. However, that initial firm customer could potentially use that, which could cause the redispatch that we've talked about. And honestly, the only way that you could maybe stop that is if you said after 10 o'clock, it's no longer practicable, and that by default you lose those rights. I think that would be a hard lift, honestly, from if I were a transmission customer, to invest in long-term rights and know that, at 10 o'clock, if I don't schedule them, I've lost them. So I think it's a definite balance in that, but it wouldn't be released to other customers for non-firm usage. It would only be available for that firm right holder to then come and schedule, if they had not voluntarily put it in the market.
Yeah, I think there's an analog for this in the EIM, which is if you submit if a firm rights holder or anybody submits a schedule after T57, you're settled for imbalance, and if there's congestion, there's a price. There's an LMP at your source and an LMP at your sink. And if there's congestion, there's price separation. But in the EIM, that's going to occur in one of the subsequent FMM or RTD, like RTPD, RTD runs. And so I feel like if you use EIM as an analog, you would want to settle this schedule. So to the extent that there's congestion, I assume there'd be price separation between the LMPs, but I don't know how that would occur. But like that's one way to discipline it would be to pass along the congestion, which would be represented in different LMPs. But I don't know how that would take place because there's the day ahead market run and then there's the EIM subsequently. So if there's opportunities for that.
Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity. I think we're going to wrap this panel up, but I want to thank all of the panelists for taking the time to think through these issues and share your views, and especially thank Meg McNall for sticking around until 8:15.
All right, Doug. So despite the topic being transmission and the last session of the day, that was simply fantastico. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to Russ, Meg, Kathy, Jeff, Kevin. Great panel. So appreciate it very much. All right. So I think now it's only me that's between you and getting a drink at happy hour. I wanted to first thank our virtual guests for joining us and hanging with us all day virtually. So thank you very much. And thank you to everybody virtually and in the room for your participation today and great conversation. And it's certainly great to have people here back at the ISO. So quickly for tomorrow, we are going to be, I know there's going to be groans. We are going to be starting a little bit earlier tomorrow. So we're starting the meeting at 8. There will be continental breakfast in the atrium area tomorrow morning between 7 and 8 for more networking and some continental breakfast. So for those of you here, I hope to see you at Scott's Seafood Roundhouse for some networking and appetizers and happy hour. And I hope to see all of you in your ISO socks tomorrow. Have a good evening.